Call a meeting to order, Natrona County Commission, June 2nd. Please, roll call, please.
Commissioner Bertolio.
Here.
Commissioner Chadwick.
Here.
Commissioner Kaufman. Here. Commissioner Milne.
Here.
Chairman Hendry.
Here. Please join me at the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, it took us a while to get all set up. We had budget hearings in here today, and so we're on our way now.
Your mic.
My microphone. Okay. First, we have the approval of the consent agenda.
Mr. Chairman, I would move to approve the consent agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carried. Next, we have public hearings. This public hearings will be conducted according to Wyoming State statute and the Natrona County regulations. Anyone wishing to speak about these issues may come up and use the mic, and we'll hear that, and we'll hear from staff. We would ask you to keep your comments about 3 minutes, and we won't have any back and forth. It won't be a debate up here. I'd ask the applicant, there's going to be some questions probably that people answer, kind of jot those down, and then after they get up, you'll have a chance to answer those questions for them. Okay. First, we have CUP 20-2, a conditional use permit. Is there a report from staff?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, yes, we have CUP 20-2. We're going to present both the conditional use permit and the variance request together. It's all the same evidence. At the end, we'll ask for separate motions for both the conditional use permit and the variance, though. This is an application by Dinosaur. The request and location, the applicant is requesting a CUP to allow a 240 megawatt utility scale solar energy system and a variance to reduce the eastern setback from 1.25 miles from a residential district to 0.63 miles. The Dinosaur Project will be located on a portion of 3,591 acres of land north of Casper and west of Bar None. The fenced area of arrays is expected to be approximately 1,710 acres. The project location and all surrounding properties are zoned urban agricultural, UA. You can see here on the slide the highlighted crosshatched area, and the red crosshatch is our leased area, while the green that's shown in there are the solar panels, approximate location of the arrays. You'll see the proximity of Bar None, the city of Casper, and Mills. Here's our zoning. It's all urban agricultural. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to the applicant so the applicant can give a more detailed presentation about their potential project, and then I'll follow that up with the conditional use permit and the variance request after they're complete. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dinosaur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. My name is John Masterson. I represent Dinosaur LLC in this CUP and variance application that's before you this afternoon. I'm going to introduce to you Ms. Christine Watson-Michael, who is the principal with Dinosaur LLC. She's going to give you a detailed background of what the project entails, what its layout looks like, access, and all the other details about the project. I've worked with Ms. Michael for about a decade, so I think you'll find her to be candid. We'll answer all the questions that you have, any questions you have about this project, and respond to any comments that are made. We also have a number of the experts and consultants and engineers who were involved in preparing this project who are available on the phone or in person who can help with any comments that you may have. I would note that the application was timely filed, Mr. Chairman. It's properly noticed. It was in front of the Planning and Zoning Commission on May 12th, where it passed unanimously. We're aware of the comments that have been received, and we look forward to answering those and seeing what concerns this body and what we can address on your behalf. Just in quick commentary, I think that you'll find that this is a project that is good for this county, provides tax revenue, jobs, but perhaps more importantly, it's a diversification of our tax base. This project is not intended to displace oil and gas or fossil fuel development. It's intended to augment those things and meet a demand for renewable energy that is coming and being driven by the market. I think it provides diversification of our energy production as well as I said, our tax base. So we'd ask that you favorably consider it, and I will turn this over to Ms. Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Masterson. And Mr. Chairman, members of the Board of County Commissioners, thank you for allowing us to come in person before you and also have the flexibility to allow members of our team to join us by Zoom. I want to mention that, like you, I'm an elected official in Utah, and so I know that these times are difficult and flexibility is important. But I have to commend staff for doing an excellent job in helping us during this time. As John mentioned, we have our colleagues and experts on the phone, and they're here to answer any of your questions as they come up. Over the last several months, we've had many meetings and open houses in the city of Barnon, and we've been able to talk to the public, and we've tried to address the concerns and comments as they've come to us today. But before we get into the application, I thought it would be good to just give a little bit of background about the company and Dinosolar. Enyo Renewable Energy is the company that is the parent of Dinosolar LLC. Similar to oil and gas projects here in Wyoming, the parent company typically manages separate LLCs for the projects. Enyo Renewable Energy is a company that was formed in 2016 between my company and a company called MAP Energy, and MAP Energy and I have been partners for over 10 years. A little bit of background about MAP Energy, since they weren't able to attend today. MAP is one of the oldest and most successful energy investors in the country. They have over $2.5 billion under management. About 1.4 billion of that was invested in oil and gas. And back in 2000, they invested in $55 million in the Pinedale Anticline, which is an asset that you know about. The next slide shows the oil and gas locations where they have mineral interests, and you can see in Wyoming, well, it's the big red blob. They've invested in every county in Wyoming but 3. And I mention that because I just want you to know that we've been a partner in your state for many years. Myself, I've been in energy since 2001, almost 20 years. I started the renewable energy program for the state of Utah and then developed the first utility scale wind project in the state of Utah. And since 2016, when we started Enyo Renewable Energy, we've been working on solar projects, and to date, well, actually by 2022, we'll have 500 megawatts of wind and solar projects in the ground in the region. Some of those recent accomplishments are on the next slide. Actually, we can skip to the next slide. Thank you. We have 275 megawatts of solar. Of that 500 megawatts I mentioned that we have under contract or negotiating contracts, those are for projects in Utah. Some of the customers who will be buying the power from us from those solar projects include universities, cities and towns, and a large commercial and industrial company like a data center. Next slide, please. Thank you. We submitted our application on March 20th. And as we completed the application, these were the things that were paramount for us to prove to you, and that we will not contribute to an overburdening of county services. As you know, these projects have a short construction timeline of about a year. And then the projects operate with limited people, about 2 to 3 people. We will not impair the use of adjacent property or alter the character of the neighborhood, and we will not detrimentally affect the public health, safety, and welfare of the community. So with that, I'll talk to you about one of the biggest questions I think we heard throughout the process was, why here? Why did you decide to locate this solar project? Of all the 62 million acres in Wyoming, why here? And I think that's a reasonable question. And as I was driving here today from Utah, as you drive and you see flat land and you see wide expanses, it's no wonder that you ask that question. But the reasons why we located here are pretty simple. For a project like solar, you need a couple of things. You need to be near infrastructure, so you need to have power lines nearby. You need to not interfere with mineral extractive industries. I think we all are familiar with what happened on the western side of your state. We need to have topography on our side, so we need to have flat land. And then we also need to have willing landowners. The next slide, please. This slide shows you your state. And what we did was we took out U.S. Forest Service land, mostly BLM land, took out lands that were rolling or too steep. We took out land that wasn't within about 10 miles or 20 miles of a transmission line. And so you can see your state starts out at 62 million acres, and it quickly comes down to something much smaller than that, about 7.6 million acres. So while that still seems like a lot, the key to this is the willing landowners. So that's how we ended up at this location. Next slide, please. The other question we have is, why now? Why are you needing to permit this now? And as you all are aware, Rocky Mountain Power is your utility. It serves Natrona County. And every couple of years, they do what's called an integrated resource plan, and they decide what power sources, what do we need to be able to serve the needs of our customers. And during that study, they determined that Wyoming could supply 354 megawatts of solar. In addition, they also found that they're going to be looking for 1,920 megawatts of new wind in your state. And so in July, Rocky Mountain Power will be issuing what's called a request for proposal, saying anybody who has a project in Wyoming that can satisfy 354 megawatts of solar or 1,920 megawatts of wind, let us know, and we'll let you know if your project is cheap enough and also does it have permits. So they want to see, are you ready? Could you actually build the project? So us coming before you today checks off the box showing that the project is ready, it has a conditional use permit, and also the county is supportive of it. So that's why we're here today. What does this mean for Natrona County from the tax base? It starts with property taxes. It will generate over $2 million in the first year. And of that, 40% goes to Natrona County School District number 1. So about 40% of that is $500,000. Over the life of the project, it will generate about $46.7 million to the county. In sales and use taxes, one of the benefits here in Wyoming is that you'll get sales and use taxes from the solar projects. These projects are capital intensive, and so you can expect to see $8.7 million in sales and use taxes when the project is built. In addition to that, we expect about $3 million that will come in indirect benefits during the construction of the project. With me today is Ron Dutton, and he can answer any questions related to the socioeconomic impact analysis that we've conducted for you. Here's the project location. I apologize, this slide is maybe not accurate because it's missing, and my pointer's not working well either. Imagine, if you will, the blue heading south and being just to the left of those topo lines. Bar None is to the east of those topo lines. To the south, obviously, is Casper, and towards the west, about 2.7 miles is the airport. So that's where the project is located. We use those topo lines to shield the solar facility from the town of Bar None. So most people think a solar project would be in a square. The reason why, if this picture were accurate, but I believe you have it in the application we provided to you, is not in a square, is because we wanted to use those topo lines to be able to shadow, if you will, from the town of Bar None. There won't be any above-grade power lines, so you'll have the solar panels, all of the pieces will be connected underground. There will be a small, I think it's a half-mile line that'll go from our project substation to the substations that will connect to. To the north, it's the Bar None substation, which is at the north end of Bar None. And then to the south, some of the project will interconnect to the Casper substation, which is the really large substation that you probably see north of Mills. There'll be a fence around the project and also a buffer around the project so that if there's ever a fire, that the fire trucks will be able to go around it. We've met with the fire district. We'll be able to provide them keys to the facility, so if anything happens, they'll be able to easily drive in. Next, thank you. So what do photovoltaic panels look like? I think there's been some misperception with some members all across the country from pilots, and we're not the Ivapov plant. It's not a big tower with reflecting. The bottom picture is what this will look like. Panels sitting on posts in the ground. Next slide, please. I like to show this picture because one of our landowners grazes sheep. And you can see that grass is able to grow after the panels are installed. To give you a sense of size, here's a gentleman, John, we'll call him John Masterson, next to the panels. He's about 6 foot tall, so he would be at the post. And the tracking system, you can see the panels will move. So that's why you have that round unit there, because it's a motor that moves the panels. The great thing about solar panels today is that they're not fixed, so they can follow the sun when it's rising in the morning, and then they move with it till it finishes in the day. Next slide, please. As part of our application with the county, and something that we regularly do for all of our permits with solar facilities, is we provide visuals of what the panels will look like in the landscape. We worked with both Jason and Trish to identify key observation points, and then we took pictures from those key observation points. And so the next several slides, you'll be able to see the panels. Again, I apologize that the pointer doesn't work, but you can see on the left side of the pictures where the panels are. Thank you, Jason. This is off of State Highway 257, about 2.15 miles from the project. And this is looking right. And again, this little yellow circle here shows you from where we took the picture. So that first one we were looking, right. The next slide you'll see we'll be looking a little to the left. So this is from the same position, but slightly looking to the left. So you can see the panels. Thank you, Jason. All right there. The next slide is a key observation point from the town of Bar None. And I mentioned earlier that we used the topography to try to, so you couldn't see the panels. The town of Bar None is well over, as Jason said, a mile or 0.63 miles away. So the next slide you can see, or you can see the panels because of the topography. Thank you. Next slide. This is about 0.9 miles from the project. Oh, here we are. Sorry. One of the other questions we often get asked are the panels reflective? And I think it's important to note that the idea of solar is that we're absorbing the power and turning it, the sun and turning it into electricity. So we're absorbing the power, or the sunlight, we're not reflecting it. And we've spent some time and hired a consultant, several of whom are on the phone, and we have an expert pilot here tonight to answer questions as well. So more on the reflectivity of the panels. As you can see on the left, what's not as reflective as the other pieces, we have asphalt, which does provide some reflectivity. Then solar panels are next, glass and metal, and then water. So as you're looking out your plane window and you're looking out, looking for glare, you're going to notice the water first. And oftentimes, metal roofs on homes will be very reflective, so solar panels are less reflective than those features. As I mentioned, we conducted a glare and glint analysis. One thing to point out is that the project is not in the airport overlay district. And we completed this study actually before your emergency regulations went into effect. And I just wanted to point out as a responsible developer, this is really important to us. It's something that we had planned to do and we had done before we even saw the regulations that you implemented in January. Because the project is within 5 miles of the airport and the communities of Barnum and Interstate 25, we hired a national company called AECom to help us with this study. And as I mentioned, they'll be on the phone. The next slide talks about when you would see glare. As I mentioned, the panels move. So starting on the right-hand side of your screen, when the panel is flat and the sun is shining on it in the morning, you would see glare. And as it tracks with the sun, there would be no glare until the evening comes again and the panel is flat. So if the sun is perpendicular to the panels, there won't be glare. But at that moment in time when the panels are flat and the sun isn't perpendicular, that's when you would see the glare. So then analysis we conducted, imagine, and we did it for the control tower. What the airport really cares about is, will there be glare for the airport control tower who's sitting in there? So what we did to eliminate any glare that will occur at the tower or on the final approach for airplanes is to tilt the panel 5 degrees. So if you recall, I mentioned if it's perpendicular, you won't see glare. So in the early mornings, we just have to tilt it 5 degrees, and then the sun will be perpendicular, and we're able to eliminate the glare. If you could turn the next slide. Here's a picture of the mitigation strategy that we'll implement to avoid glare to the air traffic control tower and on the final approach. You could see it's just a slight change in the panel from 0 to 5 degrees. As I mentioned, the glare analysis was conducted by AECom using FAA recommended state-of-the-art software. On the phone with us tonight is Steve Barrett, and he's a consultant and helps the FAA with glare studies and actually put together the FAA policy for solar. So I'll let him be the expert and speak and answer questions in more detail about that. I'm going to bring Chester France up. I'll let him tell you a little bit about himself, but he has over 25 years worth of experience as a pilot. He has his degree from Winona State University in Applied Nuclear Science, and I'll turn it to him for a few minutes. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, fellow commissioners, my name is Chester France. I am an aviation expert, and what that means is I fly airplanes quite a bit. So we'll start at the beginning. I was a flight instructor. I learned how to fly in a grass field in Minnesota, because it was a farmer's field. And from there I went to college, Winona. It's an airport that is exactly on the Mississippi River. And I instructed for 4 years. I taught people how to fly Cessna 150s, Warriors, Cubs, things of that nature, small airplanes. So I'm very familiar with that aspect of it. Later, I became a corporate pilot for a concrete company flying turboprop airplanes. It's basically a jet engine hooked up to props. Later, I did some other jobs, a bunch of jobs that I won't go into, but I was a commuter pilot for Northwest Airlink 4 years. Then I became a pilot for TWA for a year, flying DC-9s around. Currently, I'm a pilot at a major airline. I'm a captain on a 737. So I'm a little nervous today, so I apologize if I'm... Anyway, so I'm quite experienced, and I feel pretty good about that. I've flown into these solar panels are starting to go off, meaning they're spreading around the airport. They're taking off, and I'm seeing more and more of them as the years progress. So I've flown to at least 12 airports with major solar panels, and I've floated into them repeatedly. Those airports are Honolulu, Albuquerque, Chattanooga, Denver, Phoenix, Newark, San Jose, Tucson, and Las Vegas. I've also flown the largest, I'm not the second largest, it turns out, Indianapolis. I've flown into them multiple times. I fly a lot. I've never noticed glare off any of these solar panels. Not one time. I don't know that anybody has. I just got off the phone today with the control tower at Denver. I talked to the people working the control tower. There's a major solar panel farm out there. I asked the controller, have you guys had any complaints about these solar panels? Have you had anybody? Nope, no complaints. I asked the tower, I asked him, have you guys seen any glare there? Nope, it's not a problem. And I also talked to, in Lancaster, California, which is the solar capital of the universe, they claim, because they have the largest solar panel in the country. It's called Solar Star. It's a 579 megawatt facility. It's big. I've flown over it from high several times, and I've seen it, but I haven't landed at Fox. So I called the control tower on the drive over today. It's kind of a funny conversation. It was short, though. First, I told him, hey, what can you tell me about the solar project out there? And he goes, which one is out there? There's a ton of them. And so we couldn't narrow down which one we were talking about, but there's a ton. There's several phases, like a checkerboard out there. And we didn't really have to figure it out. And the reason is I asked, well, have any pilots complained about it? Not a one, he said. And I said, have you had any issues? And he said, nope. And this is standard. The FAA guidelines work. I'll say that again. The FAA guidelines work. And the reason they work is because the FAA is pretty smart. So I flying day to day, I follow the FAA guidelines, and they're written for a reason, and they're a government, well, I shouldn't say that, but they do make sense, and there's a logic behind them. That's my experience with solar panels flying around them. I have not experienced any glare. I have seen glare off of chicken outfits, commercial chicken outfits, the steel roofs. I have seen that flying across, it glints at you. But I've never noticed the glare off a solar panel. It's not an issue. Second, in this glare survey, they went through a 2-mile final all the way to the runway. No glare. It went with the panels tilted at 5 degrees, as they're planning to do. So no glare on 2-mile final on down. I studied the solar glare survey, and quite frankly, if you're at a pattern altitude of 1,000 feet, that's how, like when I'm teaching student pilots, they fly a circuit. It looks like a rectangle. And if you're at a pattern altitude of 1,000 feet, you're not going to see any glare if you're more than 5,671 feet from the panels to the west. By the way, the nearest panel is about 14,400 feet. And that's due to the law of reflectivity. The panels sit like this when they're parked. The sun's rising in the east. It hits the panel at 5 degrees. It bounces up at 10 degrees. So that's how you come up with those numbers. You use trigonometry. So that's where those are coming from. So you can use some common sense stuff. If you're not looking at the panels, you can't see the panels, so you can't see glare. Actually, what the FAA says is if it's not within 25 degrees of your center line, you're allowed to have 25 panels as long as it's 25 degrees off the runway to the side. You can have that in a line of sight off to the side, and that's just fine with the FAA. That's their recommendations. So that's the 25-degree comment. If glare's hitting you in the back of the head, you don't have any glare issues. So a lot of this pattern work, it's impossible to have a glare issue. You can't see the solar panel. The panels are tilted away from you. If you guys are at the airport and I'm out to the east, if you're coming this way on a 3-degree glide slope and the panels are tilted 5 degrees, you're going to see the backside of the solar panel. You're not going to see the surface of it. So I've talked to a bunch of pilots about this for the past 6 months, and the pilots I fly with all say the same thing. This glare is not an issue. I've combed over the NASA reports. Pilots filed NASA reports, about 138,000 of them a year. You can do a search, solar panel. I found one report, and somebody put a solar panel right adjacent to the runway. And so, yeah, there was a little bit of glare off that one, and they reported it. The system works. That's what I have to say today. The system works, so trust the system. They have completely complied with the glare survey. They've complied. They've done everything they're supposed to do, and you can trust the system. I taught pilots how to fly. The question is for the pilots out here, I'm sure, is what is this going to look like? What is this going to feel like? And I think I have a pretty good analogy, and that is I fly instructed in Winona, which is on the Mississippi River. It's about a mile wide. We saw that slide that talked about the reflectivity of water versus solar panels. And we saw that water is more reflective than solar panels. So if this was a man-made lake, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have to come. So anyway, I taught these students how to fly. I would sign their logbooks. I'd hop out of the airplane, and they would go race around the track. Now, I would worry about a lot of things. I would worry about how many people are in the pattern. How busy is it today? What's the wind doing? One thing I never worried about is what's the glare doing off the water. It never, ever crossed my mind, not once. And as a pilot, we brief threats every flight. We need to know what the threat is. Not once have I heard any of my co-pilots brief the threat of a solar panel. That would, it's just not an issue. Let me make sure I covered everything. I'm not very good at public speaking, as you can tell. Yeah, I think that's all I have. I will turn it back to Christine.
Thank you, Chester. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we just compiled some pictures of the airports that Mr. France just mentioned, and we can scroll through those quickly. You can see on this slide, just as Mr. France had stated, that there's been a proliferation of more solar around airports, and you can see in 2018 there were 4, 2019 1, sorry, put my glasses on, and in ongoing there's a 50 megawatt solar project going at the Sanford Airport in Maine, and the Edwards Air Force Base, which is the preeminent Air Force base in the country, is conducting an environmental impact statement currently. They are proposing to put between 100 and 740 megawatts of solar panels near the Air Force Base. I think most of you know that's where our shuttle occasionally lands and is an important military installation for the United States. Here we go, some pictures of panels. You can go to the next slide, please. Here's one, the Tallahassee Airport. Not only do they have panels, but they have water. The next airport, Indianapolis Airport. Next one, Denver Airport. Again, you can see that there's vegetation that grows under them. Tucson Airport. Airports in Hawaii, and you can see they're off the runway, at the edge of the runway there. The Dover Airport. Here's the Dover Air Force Base, and you can see where that's located on the next slide, thanks. From the runway, the Minneapolis St. Paul Airport, Chattanooga Airport, Chattanooga Metropolitan Airport, the Tampa Airport, and here is the Fox Field Airport that Mr. France had mentioned. This project is probably the most similar to our project in size and scope. One of the phases is over 200 megawatts, I believe, and it's about 2.74 miles away, and which is very similar to our project. As I mentioned, our project is about 2.7 miles away from the airport and similar size. This airport is similar to the Natrona County Airport. It's a municipal airport run by county governments. And then here's what I mentioned, Edwards Air Force Base, that could be between 100 and 740 megawatts. And you can see the runway as noted by the arrow. So back to the application and the variance. Thank you for letting us go through those slides. As I mentioned to the Planning Commission, what we've seen, we've studied what variances are across the country for solar panels, and Minnesota has a 30-foot setback for solar panels. New York, the town of Ridgeway, has 100-foot from participating dwellings. Typically, you would see 500 feet from non-participating dwellings, and states like New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Virginia, Maryland, and Florida all have 500-foot setbacks. The counties that I work in Utah have no setbacks. So when we saw the initial setbacks from Natrona County at 1.25, we feel like a 0.63 mile setback, which is over 2,000 feet, is probably adequate. Based on the pictures that we shared with you, it's not visible from the town of Bar None. There's no noise that will be emanating from these solar panels. And there could be lots of other things that could be cited on this project that potentially would cause more noise and sound and maybe smell. So we believe the variance is appropriate for the reasons I just discussed. The town of Bar None agreed to the waiver. We've have had many meetings with the town of Bar None and the mayor. And as I mentioned, we had an open house to share the results of our studies with Bar None. The project is on private land, where private landowners have property rights to develop their lands as they see fit, especially to the degree that they do not to infringe upon the property rights of others. And I just wanted to point out the goal. It's a goal and policy of the Board of County Commissioners to promote the use of renewable resources and the conservation of non-renewable resources. And our final slide related to the variance. We don't believe that there are any negative impacts to adjacent landowners. It doesn't preclude the uses of any of the adjacent landowners or their ability to do what they want on their land. And the Natrona County zoning resolution and its goals and policies of the Natrona County Commissioner states that future development should not adversely affect adjacent land use. And there is no adverse effect on any landowners, as I described. Next slide, minerals. As I mentioned earlier, minerals caused some problems in western Wyoming, and we provided notices to the only 3 mineral landowners in the project area. There are no active oil and gas leases, apologies, and the BLM owns most of the minerals, and we've worked with them, and they won't restrict any kind of development, any surface development. And the title company, when these large projects go on the ground and you need title insurance, have agreed to insure the project for minerals. And as I mentioned, there are no Trona mineral deposits here. In terms of wildlife, we communicated with Game and Fish, and we met with them. I don't know if there's a representative here today from Game and Fish, but I'll just point out the comment from the letter perhaps that you read in the packet. And the department appreciates that the proponent has cited the proposed facility in proximity to existing exurban development and outside of big game, crucial range, and sage-grouse core population areas. So we've fully consulted with them, received a letter from them, have committed to do the studies that they included in the letter to the county, and believe that it's a good site for the project. I know another concern for many residents is dust. Erosion and weed management. And within our land lease, there's a requirement that we suppress the dust, so that's number 1. We have, our application lays out a dust suppression measures that we will work on. And I guess the feedback we received from one of the cooperating agencies is that our application, they said, this is the way good planning should always work. I've reviewed the document and find that the weed mitigation portion is very complete and follows best management practices. That's the supervisor of the Natrona County Weed and Pet District. WLC is here. Shane Porter's here to maybe answer your questions more about the grading, but the project, as you know, is on call it 1,000 acres, and much of the property is flat, so we don't even need to grade it. We can come in and put the piles in without grading it. A small portion of the project in the northern part of the project has slopes where we'll have to do a little bit of grading. So we'll have to impact about 162 acres. But we don't plan to go out, grade it, and wait several days and then put the infrastructure in. We'll take it in smaller chunks. We can take the topsoil off, move it to the side, do what we need to do, put the topsoil back, and put our infrastructure in. And so really, of the total area where the panels will be, only 10% would be impacted, and of that 10%, we can work in small slices so that we can avoid the dust mitigation. As I mentioned, it's the northern end of the property. And Shane from WLC can talk in more detail about that should you have questions. Decommissioning and reclamation is always a concern. What happens if the facility were to not work? We've been working with the county on a decommissioning bond. We have currently in the lease agreement with landowners, we are required to implement a decommissioning bond. In speaking to our bonding company, we're able to have two designees on that bond, so we can name both the county and the landowner if that's a condition of the permit that you would like to include. There is no problem in doing that. Access is another issue that some comments we received in the last planning and zoning meeting. I apologize that our initial slide with our layout wasn't included, but if it was included, you would have seen that there was a strip of land in the northern part of the solar arrays. And so we've included a strip of land without panels so that it can accommodate the West Winds Road should it ever be built. And that could be moved depending on where easements were obtained for the West Winds Road. So that's the green route at the top is if we were to get access easements from those landowners to the project area. The other access that we're working with landowners is the blue route. So that's coming off of West Winds, and then you would take a left-hand turn by the cement plant, go around the cement plant on their land to the McMurray land, which is the east-west blue line. That's another access route. And then we have two other access routes to the south. One is in yellow off of Melody Lane. And then we've been working with Mr. Foreman on going through his land, through the BP land to the project site as well. Ideally, we would like to use the West Winds Road if it were built, or if we could partner with you on making that happen. That's a commitment that we'd like to make. But in the event we can't get all of the landowners to agree to give us access there, we need to have an alternate. And so we have the Melody Lane access point as well as going through Foreman and then the BP land. The construction timeline for the project is about a 16-month time period, so we would start doing some work in the fall and then start in earnest in the spring once the mud dries. Workforce, we are estimating that on average there would be about 116 workers over the course of the 15 months, and you can see here how it spikes in the middle months. Again, Ron Dunton is here to answer questions related to workforce. We're committed to hiring as many local employees as we can. We're hoping that 25 to 50% of those construction workers that I mentioned, over 100 workers, could come from the local workforce. We plan to have open houses and job fairs so that we could try to meet those numbers. And those are my slides for the night. Thank you for your patience, and I'll be here for questions.
Any questions so far? Yes, Commissioner Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Christine, what do you believe the total cost of this project to be?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chadwick. You can estimate it to be around $240 million, roughly.
So that does surpass the threshold for industrial siting?
It would pass that, but there was a law that was enacted in January that grandfathers this project should it be approved by this body by July 1st.
Okay, thank you.
I might just add, Everything that we've done for this county permit application is very similar to what we would have done for the industrial siting. We did a socioeconomic report, we did a traffic study, WLC conducted that. We met with the fire district, we met with the city manager at Casper. I think that's pretty much all the industrial siting application. I think here is the application that we put together for you, and an industrial siting application is very similar. So I think we tried to mimic what we would need to submit to industrial siting, because we know it's a large project and we know it's complicated, but we believe, based on the studies that we've completed, we should meet any threshold for the ISC, that we would meet that as well. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, so back to staff's presentation. Again, the green is the proposed solar panels. Christine mentioned the allotment for potential West Winds Road. You can actually see that in that slide there, that gap, if you will, in between the green. And again, the zoning is all urban ag, surrounded by urban ag. A conditional use permit criteria: the commission and board shall require showings concerning all of the following. 1, will granting the CUP contribute to an overburdening of county services? The applicant's response: the applicant believes the project will be an asset to the community without overburdening county services. The applicant has met with local fire officials to discuss appropriate fire protection measures and the technology. The fire protection measures that will be put in place will be found on page 6 of the application. Staff's proposed finding of fact: with the fire protection measures that will be utilized for this project, the project would not adversely affect local public safety authorities or the Natrona County Sheriff's operations, nor detract from their ability to provide protection services to the surrounding community. Will granting the CUP cause undue traffic, parking, population density, or environmental problems? Applicant's response: during construction, there'll be an increase in traffic from workers, or excuse me, it was staff's proposed finding of fact. During construction, there'll be an increase in traffic from workers traveling to the project area. After construction, it's anticipated that 2 to 3 workers would make daily site visits. A short period of traffic can be anticipated during the decommissioning and reclamation phases. There's no residential component to this project, thus significant project-related changes to population density are not anticipated. Environmental impacts can be measured by the loss or degradation of natural resources. The applicant has developed drainage, erosion, dust control, grading, and a vegetation plan that will utilize best management practices outlined therein. Will granting the CUP impair the use of adjacent property or alter the character of the neighborhood? Adjacent land uses include residential, commercial, light industrial, mining, and open space. Development of a solar array would not impair these existing uses on adjacent properties. The project would not significantly alter the character of the neighborhood. Although the project itself would be converted from open range land to an industrial land use, the land already contains multiple transmission lines and pipelines, and the solar array would be located at a minimum of 0.63 miles from an existing residential area. We'll see that on another slide, but that's where bar none jets out into a point right there. That's the close point to the closest residential zoning district. The county residential districts that are further to the south, we are in excess of a mile and at those locations. Staff's proposed finding of fact: the project will not impair the use of adjacent property. The project would be a minimum of 0.63 miles from the nearest residential. The project will not create long-term noise, vibration, or odor to the existing neighborhood. The panels themselves are low to the ground and use natural landscape as visual buffers. Will granting the CUP detrimentally affect the public health, safety, and welfare, or nullify the intent of the development plan or zoning resolution? During construction, there is a potential for the generation of fugitive dust, which can be adversely affected public welfare. Dust control measures will be used as needed during construction to ensure compliance with applicable county and state laws. Operation of a solar PV facility will release no effluents, toxins, or air emissions or solid waste in the process of generating electricity, and as a result, will have no impact on public health, safety, and welfare. Staff's proposed finding of fact. The applicant has provided for drainage, erosion, dust control, grading, vegetation, waste management, reclamation, decommissioning plan, environmental analysis, solar glare hazard analysis, social and economic report, visual impacts, and a traffic study. Applicant will apply for all needed county, state, and federal construction permits. Natrona County would enforce all adopted codes, in addition the IEEE National Electrical Safety Code. Findings continued. The applicant has met with Natrona County Airport, the Natrona County Fire District, the Wyoming Game and Fish. The mayor of Bar None held an open house for the residents of Bar None. The Federal Aviation Administration has conducted an aeronautical study and provided determination of no hazard to air navigation. The reports and analysis do not show any detriment to health, safety, and welfare of the public. Future development of this area is slated to be industrial with coordination with Bar None and Casper. This has been completed by the applicant with the approved CUP and variance of this project. It would not nullify the intent of the development plan or the zoning resolution. Briefly on the development plan, remember that is the enterprise zone. That was all slated to be light industrial or heavy industrial growth. Remember that was a result of an outreach to the entire Natrona County, and that was the outcomes that we came on to, is that was to be industrial growth in that area. And this solar array would qualify in that development. Now we'll get into the variance a little bit. When acting upon a variance, the board shall be guided by the intent and purpose as well as the goals and policies of zoning resolution. In addition, the board shall require showings concerning all the following. In your packet, you've got 7 criteria that are guided us in a variance. I'm going to, in the interest of time, refer you to your packets and go on a larger scale overview. Remember, the guise of a variance is you have to prove there's a hardship that the regulations are imposing on you, that there's no way that that hardship could be reduced except by the granting of the variance. We go back to our emergency solar regulations that staff recommended and the county commissioners put into place. We're on our second renewal of those emergency regulations. Those regulations were crafted after Sweetwater County's solar experience that they had. Included in those solar regulations was a minimum setback of 1.25 miles from any residential zoning district. Once the applicant gave us an application, they pointed out that that was an undue hardship, and staff did further research, and staff would agree that that is causing an undue hardship. This is a more restrictive, and Trish would attest, the most restrictive setback in the entire United States. So that meets the criteria of a variance request. This is a hardship imposed on them that is not imposed upon their neighbors. Other solar installations around do not have to meet that criteria. So staff is in support of reducing our setbacks from 1.25 to their requested 0.63. Setbacks from residential zoning districts vary from 50 feet to 500 feet. Natrona County currently requires 6,600 feet or 1.25 miles. Granting the variance of 0.63 miles is 3,326 feet, which is still well above the national average for setbacks. We're going to skip through these. These are our 7 criteria. Again, staff believes they meet all of those. You can see here that is the setback where we are the very closest, is that jog out of the former airport and Bar None there you have 0.61 miles. That's from a residential to the edge of their lease area. The 0.63 gets you to the solar panels. Public comment. Staff sent out notices to 1,528 neighbors within 1.5 miles of this installation. To date, Natrona County Development has received 54 comments, 37 opposed and 17 in favor. The comments that were received before the deadline are included in your packet, and the others are supplementals that have been added to your packet. As of May 1st, 2020, NU reached out to all the property owners who had submitted comments and individually addressed their concerns. So all the comments that were received up to the deadline, NU did reach out to those folks and try to address their comments. This application was also sent to the Natrona County Road and Bridge Department, the Wyoming Department of Transportation, the Wyoming Game and Fish, the Town of Bar None Mayor, the City of Casper, the Natrona County Conservation District, the Natrona County International Airport, the Natrona County Weed and Pest, and the Natrona County Fire District. Included in your packet, you'll see the YDOT comments on this project. What YDOT is saying is if access is taken off of Salt Creek, there'll have to be some improvements made to Salt Creek, turn lanes, and an appropriate approach permit made. So whether they do that anywhere along Salt Creek, they would have to make those traffic improvements. If they use the West Winds road access, YDOT doesn't have any concerns there. They believe there's adequate capacity in that interchange, that there would not be any improvements needed if they use that. Proposed motion: at their May 12th, 2020 meeting, the Planning Commission recommended approval of the conditional use permit with the following conditions. 1, the recommendations of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department as stated in their letter dated March 4th, 2020 are adhered to. 2, work with YDOT on appropriate access and intersection improvements through an access permit process. Evaluate and mitigate construction as necessary. 3, construction will commence no later than December of 2022 or a new CUP would be required. Our current zoning resolution requires that a conditional use permit be utilized within 1 year time frame. As you can see from their timeline, that is not appropriate here, so we have added a condition that it would have to start by 2022 or they would reapply, but that matches with their timeline. Road improvements shall be to county road standards and shall be maintained throughout the entire construction phase. This is to include dust and drainage controls. Approved access roads shall all be restored to county road standards which decommissioning has been completed. Semi and heavy truck traffic shall occur between the hours of 7 a.m. and 4 p.m. if access is through a residential area. So on Christine's slide, there was the West Winds road access, there was the Melody Lane road access, and there was a further one further south that they are working with a landowner. The intent with these additions to here was any access that's going to go through the residential portions, we want to be mindful of those residents. We want to limit the truck traffic between 7 and 4. We want to have dust mitigation, mag chloride on those roads, base put on those roads, and they've included that in their application. If they're using West Winds Road or an industrial type, then those conditions would not apply. And finally, financial assurance agreeable to the board for decommissioning per the zoning resolution. Staff would further add that last note that we had. Staff would recommend that the board approve the requirement for the decommissioning bond / financial assurance to allow staff and time to work with the applicant and their attorney for finalization of these assurances. County attorney and the applicant have been working feverishly to get this bonding in place, and we'd ask that condition just allow staff to continue that negotiation to meet the board's approval. With that, I'd answer any questions the commission may have.
Any questions?
I do.
Commissioner Chadwick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking for the picture, for the map. We have put on the shelf the viewer report for the West Winds Road to connect through to Commerce Avenue. So the route through the solar array seems to take that into account, except I noticed that there's what is being termed a wetlands present with a 50-foot Fish and Wildlife Service setback. So does the plan take that into account to go around that? Does it? Does it take that into account? I couldn't tell if it did or did not, but it didn't look like, when you actually look at the at the map,
One right here.
it doesn't look like it's set back, that there's room enough for it.
For a road in there. So we gave the proposed routes of west winds to the applicant so they could coordinate that. And I believe Christine said on multiple occasions that if that road right-of-way is negotiated, there is some movement in the panels that we could accommodate it. So we can look at that pinch point, if you will, closely and make sure we have adequate right-of-way in there and make sure we don't have panels at that location.
Well, and I'm concerned about, I'm convinced that the setback for the solar array is at the correct distance, but what about our future road
From the wetlands?
from that wetlands? It looks like it goes within 10 feet. When you look at it, and I'm having trouble
It does
finding that
show.
exact one, the one that shows it real well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
Looks like the road's headed right for it.
yeah. It does.
And if we can move the solar panels a little bit, one way or the other, we can probably adjust that.
Christine here.
Okay. There's one really good map in here that I found, and I didn't mark it.
Are you able to go in and picture everything?
Yeah, you had a picture in
You
there.
bet, on my slideshow? Yeah, we'll get there. I've got a slideshow picture that shows the green. Perfect, yes.
Right there.
Okay. So this is a preliminary layout, and as I mentioned, we left space for what was one option of the West Winds Road. As Jason mentioned, the least boundary is where the shaded lines are. So if we need to move panels to another location within the least boundary, within the variance if approved, we can do that. So when we develop projects, we always like to have more land than we necessarily need because things ebb and flow and change. And so we'll be able to move those panels. If it's not the correct alignment, we took what we received from the county and we tried to put them into our own GIS by hand because we didn't have the real shape files. So the answer to your question is that can move to accommodate a wetland if it in fact is there. That's not a problem. And you can see that there's enough space to move the panels subject to staff approving the new locations.
Okay. That answer that?
So it sounds like, one, staff needs to find that alignment, make sure that it's not going through the perceived wetlands. And two, if it is, we need to give that revised alignment to the applicant. And it sounds like they're willing to move the panels to meet that West Winds Road alignment.
Correct. That would be my concern.
Other questions? I've got one, where is it on the conditions? I know that the planning department, one of the conditions was that road, wherever their access road, has to be approved.
Right, so we'll go to the near about the last one of my slides. Not totally at the bottom, but. Almost there, getting closer. Right there. So approved access roads shall be restored to county road standards. So any access is going to have to be approved. The applicant will come to us and say, we have secured the easements and we're going to, maybe they're going to use the farther south one. We would then approve that access point.
Okay.
Or if they go through the west winds, we would approve that also. Any access point we would approve.
Okay. Other questions for staff? Any questions for the applicant? Yep.
Mr. Chair.
Chairman or Commissioner
I
Bertolio?
moved up in the room,
Yeah,
or down. I understand in the variance for setback is based on a single point. would it not make more sense to just simply pick a number that is consistent with normal projects, say 500 feet, rather than 3,326? I mean, the land is still, the panels are not, where they're going right now is not going to be affected by the setback. And, you know, to make a
Pinpoint.
variance based on one point seems, I won't say arbitrary, but it kind of, it doesn't fit with a standard. It's, you know, 500 feet, 1,000 feet, I'd pick a number, but some number that has 2 zeros at the end of it, or 1, that would be fine.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Mill.
Jason, so we've got the setback for the solar array from the town of Barnum and from residents, correct? And so they cannot build any closer to, but that's not eliminating the town from expanding or anybody owning property to developing up toward them, correct?
Right.
That's only stopping them from encroaching upon the others.
Commissioner Chairman, or Henry, Commissioner Milne, you're exactly right. This restriction is only imposed on the solar installation. The town of Bar None or the county could continue to grow up to the solar installation without any detriment or without any restrictions on that. So they could continue to grow residential closer to it if they so desire.
Okay. Thank you. Can I have my map back?
Commissioner Kaufman.
So this is kind of a technical question, as they were talking about how the sun goes and how the panels move with the sun. And it was discussed about the 5% where they're tilted and then the sun hits and goes. So will the panels ever be flat where the sun would be flat? Or is that something that's automated, or is that something air traffic control gets to control? I know these are elementary questions. I just wasn't sure how this worked.
The panels will be flat when the sun is directly overhead.
Okay.
For most of the time, midday, the panels are going to hit, the sun's going to hit 90 degrees on the panel. So it's going to track the sun like this angle here. Eventually you get this panel shades this panel over here, that's bad. You start losing a lot of energy. So at some point in the morning, they start to flatten. What was discussed is the 5 degrees was because of the glare survey. At 0 degrees, when the sun hits it at a 0 degree angle, it's going to go off at about a 0 degree angle roughly. So it's going to go out a real, and that initially created some problems in the control tower mainly, and also the same runway. So they agreed to move it. In the morning, it'll be parked at 5 degrees.
Okay.
And that totally eliminates any glare problems in the control tower or any of the finals.
Okay.
And does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah.
Good, stay up there, I got one for you. That panel, you're gonna have a 5 degree toward the sun in the morning. Okay.
Yes.
At the evening, that's gonna tilt more toward the tower. It does not go completely up and down. It's gonna stop at what
60
angle?
degrees.
At 60 degrees,
Yeah.
okay.
And then it starts to backtrack.
And then it'll backtrack for the next day. But at 60 degrees, if the sun hits it, there's no way that glare would go right to the tower.
Correct.
It'd go to the ground.
But, yeah, so actually, as the sun's, I'm a little fuzzy on what exactly the panel is, I'll be honest with you. But it's at 60. If you go steeper than that, it starts to shade the panels behind it. That's bad.
Yeah.
So that's why you don't want to go steeper than 60.
Okay.
So then it starts to backtrack. So the sun's over here coming down in the evening, and it's basically going straight up. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And then when it parks, I think it goes
Right.
5 degrees.
Okay.
And you guys, do you guys want to, we were going to hand this around, but due to COVID, we didn't think that was the best idea.
It's all right.
Yeah, bring her up here. We'll pass it around. What's that? Yeah, don't lick it.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Yeah. You've been flying all over the country, but not lately, right?
No, say about 60 days. I've just been
Hey,
I'm on call,
good.
so they've just,
I think Commissioner Chadwick had a
Thank you,
question.
Mr. Chairman. And this one's probably for Christine, but any idea how many truckloads we're talking about?
It's
I may ask Ron Dutton, are you able to answer truckloads, or would you like Shane to answer? I'm sorry, Ron, or,
Just a second.
We're just
Wait,
a second, we're gonna turn that up. Okay, try it again. There you are.
Yeah, Christine, I haven't estimated the number of truckloads based on the size and the quantity of, modules and things per truck. So I haven't answered that question. I don't know, or I can't answer that question. I don't know if anybody else has done that. So that's estimating work.
So I can try to address it. I'm Shane Porter with WLC. Well, the traffic studies probably, it should be in your packet and where the exact numbers are in there. Just in general, we're expecting an increase of 24 trucks per day. And I don't have that total number of trucks. We had to estimate at different phases of the project, different quantities of trucks are coming in depending on what they're hauling in. But it's an average of 24 trucks per day over the duration of construction, in and out.
Okay, so they will be going through on what I would refer to as residential streets, is that correct? Unless we use west winds.
Correct.
And there's, streets are, I believe Zuni was one of the streets that I saw, as well as Melody Lane.
Melody and Andy.
Those people are not going to like it, not going to like it at all. Doing the west winds thing is going to be much preferable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, I think that west wind definitely is alleviate a lot of those concerns for sure.
And I've been around a few truck drivers. I've never seen one want to drive through a residential section. They will, but they don't like it. So how, have you done any estimates on what that would cost if you took west winds to the west border of the property and to, let's say, okay, county specs, and then for giggles, state specs?
I'll answer your question, Chairman, if I may. So the other route that I mentioned, which I don't think made it to our map, I apologize, but was coming off Salt Creek Highway onto the Foreman property, which is just south of the transmissions lines that go east-west, and then coming up through BP land. So that would be an alternative that wouldn't require going through any residential or impacting any industrial routes. So that's an option that
through there,
you can.
Yeah, would come, yeah.
off of
Yeah,
that corner,
yes.
yes.
Exactly. So we'd make a left turn off of Salt Creek Highway through the Foreman property to the BP where the old tank farm was.
Yes.
And come up that way. So that would avoid any of the concerns of going through the neighborhood.
So would that be preferable to the west winds?
No, I mean, I think west winds is always preferable, but we don't have the easements. We don't have them in hand today to do that. So we have another option, and we can only work with the option that we have. So if, as time goes by, we'll continue to work on the west winds route, and if we can get the easement, we'd gladly do it. It's difficult for us to build a road to state highway standards because we're only using that road for that 16-month construction period, so we don't need a paved road.
Well, and state standards include gravel at some times.
Right. I think that the estimate that I have for, I believe, a road up to county standards, about 20 feet wide is about, call it 24 feet is about 800,000, but that's just to the east end of our property, not, again, because we don't need to go all the way through our project, we just need to get to the boundary of
your
our project.
Okay.
Right. But if the easements were obtained by us or you, we'd be happy to work with you, but that hasn't been achieved yet.
And what width of right-of-way would that be?
I think we've been talking about 24 feet is what I think your
Well,
county road
I
standards
believe
would be.
that's the road width.
Right, and then we would have a setback from that, for our panels, if that's what you're referring to. So we're,
I'm referring to how wide would the right-of-way be for the road?
80? Oh, 80.
Well,
Chairman, I believe it's 80 feet.
and Jason, you probably know the answer, may know the answer to this one. What did we put in that West Winds project that we put on the shelf? What was the right-of-way width? Because we would want to take that into account.
I don't recall if it was 80 or 100 feet, but irregardless, we gave that same alignment to the applicant, and they have made allotment for that. So if it's 80 feet or 100 feet, that's how far back their solar arrays are set. So they have built this to meet our West Winds Road design.
Okay. So really, the only unanswered question I've got there is still has to do with the wetlands. The wetlands.
Right, and we could put that in as an additional condition if you'd like to make sure we cover it, but absolutely, we'll check into that and make sure that we can navigate past that.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, just to follow, Jason, just to follow up, so the area between the Blue Road possibility and West Wind interchange is already in. So the blue road is highlighted up there. It is new road as well as the green from the point where the blue line intersects the green. That's that would be new road?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Well, cut that off.
Other questions? Yes, Commissioner Mill.
Kind of going back to the glare issue with this, in the evening, it goes down to about 60 degrees, he said, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so the
It's not-
sun's,
Yeah.
as the sun's setting, and it goes down to the horizontal, or horizon, are you going to have glare at that point going anywhere, or?
Okay, so we're talking about in the evening. The panel's at 60 degrees. Now, at some point, it's going to start going the other way.
Right.
Okay, but at that point, you got to remember so as the sun's coming down, that's actually goes straight up. And what's neat about that is if you're flying an airplane around, unless you're in a glass boat airplane, you're not going to see it because it's going through your belly of your airplane. And it's
up on
going up
Casper
into
Mountain.
space, maybe if you're in a, does that make sense to you? So yeah, it's coming over here. It's just like pool. You can think of it just like hitting a
Right,
bumper
right.
pool.
And that's what I'm saying, is like the view from Casper Mountain and whatnot, is it gonna mess with it up there?
That's a view from,
Casper Mountain.
I don't know. Let me think about it. Casper, you're in the south. The panels are pointed
They'll be
east-west.
going this
So
way.
these panels are gonna be wherever your sun is, you're not gonna, you probably won't see any glare if you're on top of Casper Mountain
So
skiing.
there's no tip to the mountain or anything like that, it'll be horizontal
One way.
to the surface.
Yeah, that's a great point. I had the same question when I was wondering. So you would think that the panels are tilted up like this towards the south, right?
Right,
They're not,
they're
they're
not.
flat.
They're flat.
They're dead flat.
And
So
so
you're
you're
pretty
not
much
getting
in line
any-
with the sun.
Anything going that way, everything's
Yeah.
in a arc this way.
Yeah, now remember, the sun changes, it's not just always
Right,
due
but
west,
But it's still.
but it's close. It's
basically-
northwest
Yeah.
or southeast
Yeah.
is where the sun rises, or northeast or southeast, excuse me, that's where the sun
Right,
rises.
so the residents of the mountain and all that, they shouldn't,
They won't,
It shouldn't
that's to the south, correct? I can't imagine how they just, Yeah, it'd be difficult. Yeah, matter of fact, you can imagine a slice of pizza where it would be impossible to get glare. Does that answer your question?
Okay, other questions?
Commissioner Hendry, Commissioner Chadwick, the applicant grabbed one of their experts and looked into the details, and they've allowed for a 200-foot zone between solar panels where that proposed road is going. So that gives us plenty of right-of-way to be able to get, even if we're talking 100 feet, that still gives a 50-foot either side. So they've allowed 200 feet between panels.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. I will open the public hearing to comments, questions. There'll be 3 calls for and against. And I'd remind you that if you've got some questions, just rattle them off, and then when you're done, then we'll have the applicant answer those questions. And try to keep it to about 3 minutes. Okay, I'll open the public hearing, and anyone who's wishing to speak in favor. Anyone wishing to speak in favor? Anyone wishing to speak in favor? Okay, anyone wishing to speak in opposition? Come on up. Give your full name and address so that we can write that down, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Will Reese, Wings Porter Danville. My home address is 39 Valley Drive here in Casper, Wyoming. I submitted a written comment on behalf of Mr. Russell Wood, who I'm going to try to briefly do my piece and get him up here. I think he'll speak more eloquently to his concerns. But to briefly summarize, Mr. Wood's main concern is to the setback variance. I think there was a map up there, and you can still see it a little. His property is, it looks to me, about as close as you can get to the project. He's maybe 2,000 feet, a little under. He has a little shop with an apartment, a motocross track, and I won't get into that too much. I think that's better communicated by him. But in our written comment, that was the main concern, is this is awful close to Russell. With that, I think in respect to your time, it would probably be best used to ask Mr. Wood to come up and describe the situation and his concerns, if that's all right with you. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman and fellow commissioners.
And then full name and address.
Russell Wood,
Okay.
3720 Arroyo Drive in Casper, 82604. And I'm not by any means opposed to the project. I think it's a fabulous project. I think it'll be a good source of revenue for the county, and I'd like to see it go through. It's just that I got kind of caught in the middle. And I've got property where me and my family, I got 2 sons, their wives, and 5 grandchildren that, we go out there a lot. We spend a lot of time on the property, and I'm just a little concerned that it's a little too close to home for me. And so I would just ask to take that into consideration, maybe ask for the solar company to make some concessions and just keep us informed. They have actually talked to us, or talked to me, and they've been very kind. And, they even kind of offered to, take power out to the property for the cost of $30,000 or something, So they're trying to make concessions and talk to us landowners, and I know there's some others around. And we're not residential, of course, but we were there first. And we did set up residence, basically. It's kind of like a second home to me and my family. And, we just spend a lot of time out there, so I would just ask that, we're kind of taken care of too. But other than that, I'm all for the project, just kind of protecting me and my family.
Okay. Questions? Commissioner Kaufman.
I'm going to put you on the spot. What are concessions to you? What does that mean for you?
Well, I'm obviously concerned about property value. I've got, my youngest son's been planning to build a home out there for the last couple of years. And now he's going like, should I? It's a bad move, It's not going to be worth it. It's going to be too much, too close to this project, you know? So property value would be my biggest concession, you know? If it's going to devalue the property, I'd like to see maybe some improvements made to bring that value back up.
That's
Okay.
it for me. Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to speak in opposition? Full name and address, please.
Glenn Januska, Casper, Natrona County International Airport, 8500 Airport Parkway. I'm here to speak on behalf of the airport board in opposition to this, not in opposition to the project itself. I think this is a wonderful project for the county. And working with Christine and working with the applicant has been wonderful. They're very professional people. I think they bent over backwards doing their due diligence, answering questions and so forth. But at the end of the day, we still have a fundamental difference in opinion in terms of whether or not the location of the proposed development is the best location in relationship to the airport. So without having to invite them to correct any statements that I make that's incorrect, because I know that they will, let me say a couple things that I think in listening to this, both the testimony today and some of the other meetings that we've had in the past. One thing the applicant can't say that this is the only location that works for them. I think the applicant indicated that when you take property near power lines and flat land, there's 7.6 million acres left in the state that this can go. And I know some of the properties within the county. So I don't believe that this development in this location is the only option for them to be able to develop within Natrona County. They also cannot say that this is not going to create glare. You can mitigate glare. They've talked about different angles of the sun, different locations where there may be glare at different times during the day. They can say that there was a glare study that was done that looked at the glare from the tower, which is important, and that within 2 mile final to the runway. If aircraft only flew in those areas, then it probably would not be a problem. But we have aircraft that fly in traffic patterns and other places that the FAA did not study. So when we look at this and say, you know, we can have a glare study that looks at aircraft in certain different portions of the airspace, but it doesn't look at all of them. So when the FAA makes a determination of no hazard, you have to be careful. FAA is not looking at necessarily aircraft performance in different locations around within traffic patterns and so forth. So I don't believe that they can say that this is not going to create glare. They certainly also cannot say, if it's going to create glare, that it's not going to interfere with aircraft or with pilots. Maybe the most important or one of the most critical aspects of flight width is in the last 2 miles for an aircraft on file to the runway, but that doesn't mean that that's the only time that there could be glare that could interfere with the pilot. So if this is not the only location, they cannot say definitively it's not going to create glare and that glare could not have an impact on pilots at the airport. Then I think you have to look at what the county commissioner's responsibility is. Earlier in the meeting at 5:38, you approved the grant, federal grant. As part of those grants that the county has been approving for as long as I've been here, 13 years and probably longer, there are grant agreements, there are grant assurances. If the FAA was the be-all and end-all when it determines whether or not something is safe, my job would be easy. FAA makes a determination, they say it's safe, and it's fine. But the FAA didn't say it's safe. They said it's no hazard, because the FAA does not look at all aspects. They rely on us as the owners of the property that have the responsibility. And I think you probably all received a copy of the letter. Just some of the things that the county is responsible for doing. Making sure that the airport is operated at all times in a safe condition. The county will not cause or permit any activity or action which would interfere with the use of airport purposes. If this creates glare and it interferes with the airport operations, then that would be a violation of our grant assurances. The county will take appropriate action by preventing the establishment or creation of future airport hazards. It will take appropriate action to restrict the use of a land adjacent to the airport to activities and purposes that are compatible with normal airport operations, including takeoff and landing of aircraft. So if you make a determination that even how small of a risk there is, that if this is not compatible with the airport, if it does create a hazard, And if it does create a situation that is not safe and interferes with the airport purposes, then the county has grant assurances where you basically have said definitively you will take action to prevent that from happening. Now, if you believe that this is not, that is compatible, and it's a hazard, or maybe that it's a small hazard, there's not a lot of risk to it, or that this may not interfere with airport purposes or may have a minimal impact, then what I would say is the things that we have outlined in our letter that we would ask that would be made condition, or if this was something that you're going to approve, that it would include these. And I think one of the big things for us is not only to have a glare study that's going to look at the aircraft and the traffic pattern, because that's where a lot of aircraft are flying, but there is a $100,000 mitigation bond to ensure adequate resources are available to mitigate any adverse impacts to air navigation, and that running with the land that the applicant shall mitigate any panels that cause glare to aircraft taking off from, landing at, or navigating in and around the airport, up to including the removal of the panels. If they are so sure that there's not going to be a problem with the panels creating glare, they would have absolutely no problem having a mitigation bond and a provision in place that says, if we're wrong, because the airport's been here for a lot longer than we're talking about, it's going to be here for a long period of time. The county has invested hundreds of millions of dollars into this facility. And I don't think you want to be wrong and allow creation of something that is going to interfere with the navigation in the aircraft. If we're wrong and there is minimal risk, then the applicant would have no problem providing a mitigation bond and being responsible for removing any panels that cause glare with the airport. If they're not willing to do this, then I would guess I would have more of a question on whether or not how much they believe that there's not going to be glare from this facility and what the impact will be on the airport. So with that, I would answer any questions if you have any questions.
Okay, Commissioner Chadwick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Januska, so who would be the arbiter of whether the glare is detrimental, and to how would you measure even that it is detrimental to aircraft coming and going? How would you propose that be? And I'll go ahead and ask it now. Would this mitigation bond be in perpetuity or until the end of the project? Is it forever? Let you answer those.
Commissioner Chadwick, I honestly don't know. We would probably have to work out what the mechanism is going to be. If this is something where there's not a lot of, if you go to the airports and you listen to the applicant and, there's not a lot of complaints, or the airport hasn't received complaints, the control tower hasn't received complaints, I wouldn't envision that there's going to be a lot of times that this is an issue. My guess would be is it would be reported by a pilot, and if it was a one-time type of a thing, it's probably not something that we'd be looking for. But if a pilot says, we've had this situation, we had other aircraft reporting similar situations, whether it's by time of day or whether it's location, that's what we would probably be, we'd be looking at. I don't know what the answer is, but I would like to make sure that there are some assurances there. And if there's better assurances, and if the applicant has better assurances or the county does, that's wonderful. But I think we've invested too much in the facility to just trust that if there's a problem, everyone's going to be willing to solve it. I think there has to be some type of a mechanism in place that identifies if we do have a problem, and we have to work on identifying what it is and what the solution is, that there's more than we're going to sit down and we're going to try to work out a solution. There has to be something, I think, that protects the airport.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a follow-up, so is this mitigation bond something that was brought up at the planning and zoning?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, it was not brought up at the planning and zoning. It was something that we've had discussions about that says, we had a pilot town hall meeting, I think a Zoom meeting on a Friday before the conditional use permit went before planning and zoning. And we asked the question, well, how do we know today if there's a problem? And I think the applicant's response was wonderful. We'd sit down and we'd try to work something out. But we don't know who the players are going to be, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So in looking at this, saying, well, how do you do this? I mean, you have performance bonds, you can have payment bonds, you can have reclamation bonds. But what's the proper mechanism or what's the proper tool to have something during the time period? Whether it's the life of this, I don't know if things can change over a period of times where something's not a problem for the first 5 years and it gets to be a problem afterwards. But, looking at this saying, what can we have in place that's going to ensure that if there is problem, or if there are problems, we have something in place. So this was something that we discussed with the airport board after the Planning and Zoning Commission looked at these things specifically, and those were the recommendations.
So as to length of time, so if it goes by 5 years and you have one guy say, oh, and no others, do you dismiss the bond? Do you allow them to dismiss that bond? How, or is that something also that would have to be worked out?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, I don't know. Again, I don't know if conditions change. I don't know if the curvature of the earth, I don't know whether or not there's something that can be fined for 5 years. And then all of a sudden, whether I don't know what could change that. So I don't know what the appropriate answer, if it's something that would be in place in perpetuity for as long as the development is there, or if it's something that we can say, after 10 years or something else like that. I don't know what the useful life of the facility and the panels are. I don't know if you replace panels after 5 years, that with new technology, that what might be in place today. We say after 5 years that we're going to get rid of the mitigation bond, and we find out that panels change and that the new panels that we haven't had before cause a problem. So I guess that's my concern with saying at a certain point in time that the risk goes away, because I don't know what changing in technology and so forth, if what might not be a risk today may be a risk or a problem in the future.
Mr. Nelson.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just to speak to this issue, I did meet with staff when we received Mr. Januska's letter and discussed the concept of this mitigation bond. And I think for some of the reasons that Commissioner Chadwick mentioned, I think administration of that bond would be difficult. But the way that we think that the county would address this is really twofold. One, I think it's important to remember that what you're going to be deciding is whether to grant a conditional use permit. And that means it's conditional, and it's conditioned on certain stipulations that will be in the order of approval. And one of those conditions will be that it doesn't create a hazard to the airport. If at some point in time the county became aware of a change in circumstances, and this now did imperil our FAA grant assurances, or clearly constituted, in the opinion of the county, a hazard to the airport, then we would have the ability to go back in and reconsider the conditional use permit. It would allow us an opportunity to work with the owner at the time to mitigate that. And if all else failed, it would be within the realm of possibility to revoke the conditional use permit and enforce remediation of the site. And as I think Jason in his presentation outlined, we'll be working on an adequate surety bond or some other financial assurance. It will be a co-obligee or a dual obligee with the landowner that would allow the county to call on that bond to fund basically the remediation removal of the solar installation should cause exist to do that. And one thing we'll be working on, much like in the oil and gas context, we'll be looking for a certified engineer's estimate of what it would cost, and that's the amount of bonding we'll be working on getting. Those details are to be yet hashed out with the applicant. But so we do feel that there is a mechanism that would allow the county to protect the airport. But the current proposal with the mitigation bond, it seemed to be wrought with pitfalls. Who would make the determination? If there was disagreement, how would you mediate that? I could see us ending up in court. It just seemed to be a very messy mechanism, and so I think that we agreed that the route that I just outlined probably would be staff's preference and our preference in dealing with this potential.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, can I respond to that? If the mitigation bond is not the most appropriate one, then I would ask that if this is something that the commission is going to approve, that there would be that provision in place that, and I'm not sure if the best way, the verbiage, but specifically that the condition bond, that the conditional use permit is based upon the fact, or the assurance that there will not be glare that's going to interfere with the airport, and that whatever the mitigation methods or we would do, that is very specific, that if that happens and, and we need to mitigate it, and they're unwilling or unable to mitigate it and so forth, that if that's the mechanism, that's fine. I would just ask that that be very clear in the conditional use permit approval, that it specifies that.
Okay. Other questions for Glenn? Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Does the applicant have any more statements that they'd like to do about that one? About the glare study and that you've done?
Thank you, Chairman. I might ask Steve Barrett to introduce himself and maybe address some of the questions related to the glare. And then I might point out that we have been working with Mr. Woods as he is an adjacent landowner. I just point out that he's about a half-mile away, but we have been in communications and will continue to be a good neighbor with him as we move forward. Mr. Barrett, are you ready? Okay, you're on mute. Okay, great.
Hi, this is Steve Barrett. I just want to make sure you can all hear me.
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Great. Nice to be with you. I was hired by the FAA about 10 years ago to help them develop their solar policy and their solar guidance. And at that time, they were concerned about the potential issues of glare. So in 2013, they produced the actual solar policy. And so this solar policy was directed towards the abundance of solar projects that were being developed on and near airports. And as I think the applicant, Christine, already said, the project has been designed to meet that solar policy and the what they call the ocular hazard standard. And that policy has been in place for the last 7 years, and it's been really terrific mechanism to make sure that this issue has been addressed. And in that time, in the past 7 years, we've had a huge number of solar projects developed across the country, and there have not been any reports of complaints about glare. So it's been a very successful process. As far as the FAA's responsibility here, the FAA's mission is to ensure a safe and efficient air transportation system for the country. So the last thing that the FAA wants is to hear that there might be an issue with glare. And so if in the future, if a project is built and there are complaints from pilots about the issue, that those complaints could be directed to the FAA, and the FAA could step in and require a solution to the problem. And there was, I think Christine mentioned at the beginning that this project is proposing solar photovoltaic, these solar modules that absorb light, and not the large towers with the mirrors. And there was a project in Southern California in the desert with the mirrors. So it was one of these projects that caused a lot of glare, where the FAA had reports from pilots, and they were required to make corrections. So I just wanted to provide that context, that the FAA has, a responsibility to make sure that that our air transportation system is safe. They were concerned about the potential of glare from solar photovoltaic projects. They developed a solar policy that's been in place for now about 7 years. It's been very successful, And if there are any issues in the future, the FAA certainly could become involved. So those were the things I wanted to state. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Barrett?
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Mill?
Mr. Barrett, so that policy of the FAA's, does it address within it the approach, departure, downwind, upwind, crosswind patterns?
So when the FAA was developing the policy, what they were most concerned about was the air traffic control towers around the country. And the main reason for that is that the controllers are observing visually aircraft movement on the ground, and also when the aircraft are on approach and landing and at greatest risk of an accident. And so the policy states that there shall be no glare, zero tolerance for glare on the control tower. And that's because of the critical reason or mission of the controllers in the control tower, and also their requirement they need to be very visual. And then the policy also addresses pilots, and actually the policy allows for what they call a low level of glare on pilots on final approach. So that's, as you stated, from 2 miles down to touchdown. And again, that's the most critical time of flight, when the pilot and the aircraft is at greatest risk for crashing. And even in that approach, the policy recognized that pilots are accustomed to different sources of glare in the environment. So at the beginning of the presentation, I think it was talked about, bodies of water, snow is a reflective surface, flying into the sun. So pilots, just as we do as we drive our cars, if you drive into the sun, you move the visor, you adjust for that. So the policy is set up so that it recognizes that pilots are exposed to some glare. So it allows for some glare on final descent. It does not cover any of the other flight patterns around airports. And I think there are two main reasons why it doesn't. First of all, the FAA recognized that those patterns are not the most risky flight patterns for a pilot. The riskiest is when the pilot is on approach and landing. So that's number one. Number two, a lot of airports have a lot of different flight patterns around the airports. So it's difficult to be able to model all of those different situations. So that's a long answer to say, no, the modeling does not address all of the flight paths, but it's focused on the most critical and riskiest ones to pilot.
No, I think you brought up some good points. I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak in opposition? Thank you, Eileen.
Respectfully, not actually in opposition.
Name and address.
Oh, I'm sorry. Shelley Burnett. I live at 3533 Andy Road, Casper, Wyoming. I'm not opposing it. I have a question. And I need the other map, guy. You know, the one like this? So I could show them where we're at.
Okay, so my presentation.
It was the one that was on our letter.
Okay. My presentation, probably about 3 slides here.
Thank you.
Right, this one, ma'am?
That'll work.
Okay.
How are you?
Mr. Chairman, may I provide something to Commissioner
Sure.
Moore while that's getting pulled up?
You bet.
I live on Andy Road. You see this little jut where it juts out there? That's where I live. I'm curious about, one, the variance. If they give them that variance, then later on, can they just come right on up to my road? Because it's clear up to the road. Did that make
I think
sense?
the answer, go ahead, Jason.
Did that make sense?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
So the leased area goes right up to Andy, but they're not going to put solar panels. Right now, they're a mile away from you.
That's what they said.
And no, they
told
would
me.
not be able to build solar panels
Okay,
right up
that
to.
was my concern.
They included that lease area, I believe primarily for access.
Is that out of the question now? Off the board, the Andy Road access?
It was Melody Lane.
Melody, Andy, then across.
Well, they said last time, we said that they was gonna use Andy if they couldn't get the other two. And I was gonna go, that's right in front of my house. So, sorry.
Ma'am, I can answer that. It will
Okay.
not go, even if they have an access road down there, it will not go in front of your house. They'll turn and go toward the solar panels before your house.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anyone else wishing to speak in opposition? Yes.
Hi. I'm Becky Walsh. I live at 2817 Prairie Lane. I own 230 acres right beside the land that they're doing all this. I have a problem with the variance. Number one, my kids and grandkids all ride four-wheelers and stuff. We've had cattle on that land. I've had the land for 25 years. And 12 years, me and my husband moved up there on the land. And I have a problem with them coming right, because some of the section, it looks like they're coming right next to my fence line. So it's gonna affect my property value, and I don't want the solar panels right next to my fence line.
Okay. You're on what street?
I don't have a physical address. I live at 2817 Prairie Lane in Bar None. Some of the time, my property, I have 230 acres. And we have a place up there that we live on. I'm by Russ Wood. He's got 10 acres and I've got 230.
Okay.
Okay.
That's my question.
Anyone else wishing to speak in opposition?
Not really opposition, but I got a question.
Come on in.
Sean O'Brien, 7361 Forum Lane, Evansville, 82626. I just want to know if there's any battery storage capacity on this, in this project, or if it's running straight from solar on the power lines and out, or is it going to a battery substation basically, and then out? That's all I want to know.
Okay, we'll answer that here in a little bit. Anyone else wishing to speak in opposition?
Mr. Chairman, Tom Van Cleef, 5420 Blackmore Road here in Casper. I'm a local resident. I'm a local business owner. I'm a local professional pilot and a local combat veteran. I'm not opposed to this development because I think it will bring in jobs and there'll be opportunities. But what I am concerned about is that I'm probably the closest thing we have standing here in this room for everybody on this board to hear from a subject matter expert who's not on NYO's payroll. We could discuss how that happened and whether or not that's an issue. And Mr. Nelson will probably be able to discuss that at a later point in time about the open meeting law. It's not a problem. What I am mostly concerned about is that you hear other points of view. And what you're hearing today is you're hearing from the smartest people in the room.
They're here in the front row, they're on the computer, they're on the phone, and they're going to come up with reasons why anybody who comes up here and has a discussion or has a concern is just wrong and ill-informed. You're not going to hear the other parts of it. You're not going to hear about, yes, Mr. Barrett's a great guy, brilliant man, but the policy that he wrote was designed for use on airports. Doesn't cover solar panels off airports. We're going to hear about how there's no way to model everything that can happen in a traffic pattern, but no discussion about how you could take the same algorithm, the same software they're using, and instead of aiming it at a point on the ground with the elevation of the control tower's cab, take different points in the pattern. Put those elevations in there, and you have a pretty good idea whether or not this thing is going to affect the pattern. We heard from Mr. France, who, bless his heart, you're a fine public speaker. Don't sell yourself short. And as a professional pilot, I think he did better than most of us would have done. But anecdotal evidence about what he's talked to friends about, phone calls he's made, things he's read, that doesn't make up for a professional survey, a computer report, if you will, that would give us the results and the information we need. And it's important for us to have that, number one, so ENYO can be successful with this project. Because if we don't have that report on glare and we're using anecdotal evidence, then when we do have a problem, and I'm not sure if it was Commissioner Chadwick who asked the question about how would that be reported, how would that be resolved? Well, it would come through what's called, in shorthand, a NASA report, an ASDS report, okay? And those can be filed by the pilot, they can be filed by a tower controller, they can be filed by anybody, all right? But if something like that comes up, we as a county need to show that we did our due diligence and that ENYO backed us up and supported us with due diligence by providing us the information we need to be able to have a defensible position. All right, now Mr. Nelson talked about different things other than a mitigation bond that could be used. But Ms. Michael was very clear. When this thing goes up, it's going up on private property, private land, and it is private property. And if you think the challenges of having to figure out mitigation with private land and private property are a challenge, let me explain it to you in a nutshell. If there's an ASDS NASA report filed and the county, under Chapter 20 of our airport assurance agreement, has to mitigate the risk, we as taxpayers are going to end up paying ENYO to change their facility, which created the problem in the first place. So, I know ENYO is here to be successful. Whether or not we put this facility up where it goes up now or whether they move it, that's not the question. The question is, do we give ENYO the opportunity to be good corporate citizens and good corporate neighbors? Give them the opportunity to step up to the plate right now and either agree to a mitigation bond of some sort or agree to some form of a mitigation in case there's a hazard. Because otherwise we're going to have a problem. All right? Because it's not going to be a local pilot and it's not going to be anecdotal. It could be a medevac flight coming in with a sick kid. And I don't think anybody in this room wants to be responsible for that. Because our airport supports Wyoming Medical Center and it supports all the surrounding communities, not just in Natrona County, but in a big portion of the state. So let's give them the opportunity to be good citizens and step up to the plate and show us they're ready to do that. Similarly, we hear about all the jobs that this is going to create and how this will bring in server farms and distribution centers. I think ENYO would be willing to help us out with that. I think a performance clause is something that's not unreasonable. 2 or 3 jobs, once this thing is completed, is not a lot of economic stimulus when it comes to jobs. But ENYO and their parent companies are a $2.4 billion company that gave $150 million to charity. I think it's not unreasonable for them to come up and be able to say, we will help Natrona County with X amount of dollars for this many years and work with you to bring in these jobs, these server farms and things like that. Now, as I said, what we're going to hear from now is the smartest people in the room telling me why I'm an idiot. Well, as a combat fighter pilot, I'm used to being outnumbered. So if anybody has any questions for me right now, I'll take them before I have to give up the microphone and be told what a jerk I am.
Any questions?
None, thank you.
thank you for your service as a combat pilot.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Anyone else wishing to speak in opposition? Okay, I heard a couple of questions in there for the applicant. One of them, the battery question. Are we gonna have batteries out there? Maybe someday?
Mr. Chairman, your mind reader, maybe someday, but as planned, we don't anticipate batteries as of today.
So all the power is gonna go right into the grid?
Correct. So from the panels to the transmission line to the substation.
Okay. Then about the mitigation, and there've been lots of talk about the bonding, and I think you had mentioned it earlier, that you were looking into that, or I don't know.
The decommissioning reclamation bond.
Okay.
We have, in our lease agreement with the landowner, we have a requirement to, at year 15, to implement a decommissioning bond. And so we have to get a licensed professional engineer to determine the cost of the reclamation and decommissioning, and then we have to post a bond in that amount. You do take out salvage value. There's really not a lot of salvage value from a solar property, so if it costs, I call it $500,000 or $1 million to reclaim, we have to post a bond in that amount. And we're allowed to have a dual obligee to county attorney's comment earlier today. And so we're happy to oblige whatever the county deems that is necessary to decommission and reclaim. If you felt like we should have that in year 1, we could have it at year 1. But as I mentioned in our land lease, it's in year 15.
Okay.
I think Ms. Walsh mentioned her concern about the variance as well. The bound from our panels to her 240-acre parcel is about 0.3 miles, and from the edge of the panels to the home on her property is 0.84 miles. And again, we've reached out to both her and Mr. Wood to try to find some way to mitigate their concerns, but we were still in those negotiations.
Okay. So you're from the Walsh boundary line, you're 0.3 miles?
0.37 miles
Okay.
to the solar plant panels.
1,500 and some feet.
Correct.
Okay. And Commissioner Coffin, you had a question?
Yeah, no. I think just to follow up, so you addressed the reclamation bond, but there's been a lot of talk, and I know this came up at planning and zoning too, about a mitigation bond. And I've heard a lot. I don't know if it's possible. I've heard it's not. I've heard it is. I've heard, please consider this as you listen to this today. So I'm curious, is that different than, I think it's different than the reclamation bond, so it'd be during, and I haven't heard anybody address that that's a possibility from your firm.
Well, I think that this was not brought up at the Planning and Commission. It wasn't brought up at that meeting. We didn't receive the comments from the airport board until very recently. I think it's been a week since we received their letter, more or less, requesting the mitigation bond. So as I mentioned, we've turned in the application on March 20th, and that was the first in time we had that request from the airport board. I might add that Mr. Januska is correct. We've been trying to work with the airport for years. In fact, back in 2017, there was a request from the airport to actually locate the solar panels on 5,000 acres of their land. So we've been going back and forth. So it's hard to anticipate or say, yes, we would do that without, I think, to Commissioner Chadwick's comment, who's the arbiter? What if somebody makes a complaint? What would the fee? I mean, it's just, it's a little bit more, it's difficult for us to consider that when we don't understand maybe the parameters that would be associated with it. So I apologize. I think with 1 week's notice, maybe John can talk here. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, a couple of comments on the mitigation bond, as I understand it, is the suggestion is to post a bond, and should there be problems, the bond can be called, and then the county would have funds to go and mitigate any glare problems that may exist. As I understand it, that's the concept behind it. The practical issues that I see with it is who gets to decide when glare is an issue? How much glare is that? How many times does it appear? Those kind of things come into play. It's a lot easier to do a reclamation bond when you can have an engineer go out and say, this is what it's going to cost you to collect all this and get rid of it and put things back how they were. But in the sense that we're talking about, as I understand it, this kind of a bond, it would be, in my mind, nearly impossible to administer. And my parents taught me not to talk in absolutes, but I'm not aware of any other solar farm in the country that has that kind of a setup. I could be wrong, but I'm just not aware of it, that it's something that's used. I think that FAA policy covers it as best as these things can be handled. So for what it's worth, Mr. Chairman, I hope that's of some help.
Okay. Question, Commissioner Mill.
You may be able to answer this or whoever. What would it take? I mean, he's asking for a glare study from various points in the pattern, various altitudes. What would it take to plug in a few numbers here and there and just run that program just to alleviate some concerns?
I think the difficulty, and speaking as more of a layman, so I may turn to my friends here, is how do you run all of these conceivable flight paths and patterns, no matter how sophisticated your computer or how good, if you're going to be off, do you run this one and then do you run 50 feet to the left and then 50 feet up? And I don't know how you would do that in an airspace, a three-dimensional airspace over and around an airport. I just imagine that it would be a nearly infinite task. And I'm going to ask Christine and our pilot if they have comments, and also our consultants on here, but I cannot imagine how that would be done as a practical matter. And I think that's why the FAA has, and that policy is exactly made for solar panels on an airport. But when we came in, we wanted to do, a little bit more than, and try to address these concerns, even though we're not on the airport. That one covers the control tower as well as kind of as this final approach path as it's defined on there. So given that that's the standard, that's the state of the art, that's what we decided to do and to go ahead and do.
Okay,
This is Steve Barrett. I was just going to jump in if I could.
go ahead.
Just to emphasize on the solar policy, I know it's been referenced a couple times as only applying to projects on airports. It was developed for airports to assess glare issues for airport projects. But the FAA actually strongly encourages projects off airports to also use it. And that's specifically in its policy, and it's just a legal issue for the FAA that they can't require it. And what ENYO has done is they have used the policy voluntarily and they've demonstrated compliance. So to say that it's not useful for projects that are not on airports, that's not correct. The FAA actually asks or strongly encourages projects off airports to also use the policy and the modeling, and ENYO has done that. As far as the different flight patterns, I think, it's kind of been stated that there are lots of different patterns at different airports, and it's hard to model different things. I think it's conceivable to do it, but I think the FAA, again, I may sound like a broken record player, but they were really concerned about the air traffic control towers first, and then they were concerned about pilots on final descent when they're most at risk. And so all of these other flight patterns you can look at, it's conceivable to do it, but there's no standard to follow when you're looking at all of these different things. So again, I would just go back to the fact that the FAA was concerned about the potential glare impacts to airports and to pilots. It developed a policy, and after 7 years and lots of solar projects developed, there haven't been any complaints. It's been a success. And I'll stop there.
Questions? Commissioner Kaufman.
I would just have a question for our attorney. So the process that was outlined through this, that if they weren't able to meet the conditions on the CUP and we had to mitigate that way, Eric, do you have a high degree of confidence that that's available to us if we go down this road and there isn't a mitigation bond, we do have a challenge we didn't anticipate? Like you feel like we're in a good spot on that?
So, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Kaufman, so, I mean, good spot is relative. Do I think we would have the legal ability to do so? Yes. I think the reason you have conditional use permits is so that you can look at things on a case-by-case basis and approve projects based on certain conditions being met. I think regardless of whether you have a mitigation bond or we're going in to revoke the conditional use permit, I mean, it could be a lengthy process and contentious, but do I think we would have the legal ability to do so? I do. I think that, true, this is on private property, but it is subject to the county. So I think we have the legal standing to do that, just like if there's a oil and gas well on private property, the state can come in and plug and abandon. So I think we have that legal basis. And I feel like we would be, from a county standpoint, and really by extension the airport, I think we're as protected as we possibly could be.
Okay. Anyone else wishing to speak in opposition? Anyone else wishing to speak in opposition? Or anyone on the phone? Anyone on the phone? And as I understand it, we did not have any calls last night to request. Okay? Thank you. I'll close the public hearing. Is there any other questions from commission or motion?
Mr. Chairman, I have
Yes.
one quick question for the applicant. In looking at land ownership, everybody keeps talking about setbacks. What is the actual setback that you're doing within the lessor's lands? So, for example, I guess what I'm getting at, when I look at this, those landowners that have agreed to lease land to you appear to continue to own property to the north, all to the west, all to the south. You tend to follow the topography on the east side so that a lot of the panels are not actually abutting anyone's private property immediately to the east, except for in a couple little spots. So when I look at this particular one, approximately how far are you setting back from the lessor's property line? Does that make sense? Not from anybody else's houses.
So you're asking.
What's your setback you're using within the bounds of your?
Sure. I might call Spencer Martin. Spencer, do you recall the setback between the lease boundary and the panels, I think is your question. Spencer, if you could take yourself off mute, or maybe Jason can. I don't know if you have the information at your fingertips. Oh, sorry. Mr. Chairman, is that okay?
Yes.
Sorry.
Mr. Martin?
Yeah, hi. Let me just understand the question better. The setback between the fence line and panels?
Or back from the property line, I think, as the Phelan lease, how far back from inside that property line are the panels going to start?
Mr. Chairman, basically, what I was asking was, I better mute myself. What I was asking is a typical setback. So if you have a house, what's the setback requirement to put a garage on it or something like that? So I'm just curious what setback you're actually having on the panels within the property boundary.
So Spencer, maybe you could speak to the panels, what's the distance between the panels and the fence line? What's that distance? I think it's 20 feet, but please correct me if wrong. And then what is in places the fence line to maybe the edge of the property boundary?
Well,
Because there's-
in looking at this, there's been some questions about how close are these panels to my house or my boundary line? I don't know very many places where, short maybe wind turbines, that you can't force somebody within their boundary to have a 500-foot setback from their property line to something, because especially when something is as passive as solar panels are, that are really not causing any continuous motion or whatever. I guess I'm just trying to get some sense how far back you are. I mean, when you actually look at it, there's only a couple of places where the topography is allowing you to go very close to the east that would encroach on more than 10 feet or 20 feet on a property line. So I'm just curious of what kind of standards you're holding yourselves to on that, if there is one.
Mr. Chairman, Spencer, are you able to answer that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It varies quite a bit around the edges of the project, but about the closest the fence line comes to the leased land boundary, looks like it's up in the northeastern portion of the project. It's about 32 feet between the fence line and the property boundary, and that's the minimum. For the most part, it's other places where the fence line is close to the boundary, it's around 80 feet. But for the most part, it's anywhere from, it gets up to a quarter mile or more from the leased land boundary.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Mr.
Commissioner
Chairman.
Milne.
I don't know who wants to take this, but when the project does come to an end and you're looking at decommissioning, what are you leaving in the ground?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, I think, Evelyn, would you mind taking that, please? Thank you.
So, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So typically when you decommission a solar project, you'll remove all of the panels and you'll remove the racking system and cut things about 3 feet below grade. And so anything like underneath, there's going to be a collection system that's bringing cables from the solar facility to the substation. Typically those are de-energized and abandoned in place because they're more than 3 foot below grade. But typically everything will be cleared kind of in that 3 foot below grade area so that people can continue to farm and ranch and things on their land. So it would return to beneficial use after decommissioning of the facility. Does that address your question?
Yes, thank you.
And then I would just add to that, that's also in our lease agreement with the landowners, that we remove everything up to 3 feet.
Okay. Question?
I've got one more. Thank you,
Commissioner
Mr. Chairman.
Chadwick.
And this one would be for Jason, for sure. Item 6 in the Planning and Zoning Commission recommendations says, financial assurance agreeable to the board for decommissioning per the zoning resolution. It says to the board. What board?
In the zoning resolution, the Board of County Commissioners is the board. So this decommissioning bond has to be to your liking. And that was where we recommended the amendment to that number 6 that would allow staff to continue with legal to get that in place.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. That
Mr.
one
Chairman,
there.
just to add to that, so back in January, we adopted these emergency rules, and they were subsequently extended. And the way it really interplays with our zoning resolution, it by reference incorporates the reclamation and the bonding standards applicable to wind turbines. And so there's some general standards in there, and that's really what we're going off of. And it's stuff that we've discussed here, that it has to be based on an amount determined by an engineer and so forth. So because it's the intent is now to move forward with permanent promulgation of these rules, but because it's kind of bootstrapped in kind of in an emergency manner, it does get a little bit complicated when we have to read through it. And so that's why our recommendation was to allow us to work with the applicant to ensure that the proper surety is posted that complies with our regulations.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Commissioner Kaufman?
This one will be quick. Are there any studies done around the facilities that have installed solar panels if it does impact property values? I don't know if anybody has any research available to that.
Commissioner, Ron, I don't know if you or Evelyn could take that, if you want to raise your hand if you feel comfortable taking that. I'm not familiar with any studies myself related to solar panels, only wind turbines. Evelyn or Ron, can either of you address that? Evelyn says no. Ron?
No.
Ron says no.
What I was going to say is that there have been a few attempts I would consider really reliable in terms of there hasn't been a broad sampling of property values and projects in enough different settings to give reliability to it. And so many of the solar facilities are on public properties, like airports and things like that, where it's a little bit less of an issue. So I'm not aware of anything reliable.
That brought up a question for me, I guess. Down the road, there are companies that want to locate by these kind of green power systems. So in a way, it could enhance property values. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct. Sorry, Chairman. That's correct. What we found in Utah, we have a data center that's being built in Utah by Facebook, and there's land adjacent to that where another data center might come. And one of the reasons why they're considering coming to that location is because there's probably 20,000 acres of flat developable land for solar that can easily just get plugged into their facility. And so these data centers tend to come in locations that support and perhaps like to see solar projects. So it's an economic development tool that's been used in Utah quite successfully. I think the Facebook data center, I want to say it's brought, I don't know, $500 million to Utah. And from there, it's also supported 1,000 megawatts of solar. So that's $1 billion of solar investment in the state. So it's been quite a boon for us in Utah. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move to approve CUP 20-2 to include the staff's findings of fact and the Planning and Zoning Commission's recommendations with the addition of
The bonding requirements?
No. And I'm searching for the words here. And this will be on Jason.
A review of the West Wind's right-of-way to assure that it goes through the project area adequately.
And avoids the wetlands. That would be item 7 in the Planning and Zoning Commission recommendation. Add that to it.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
just one question, I think, regarding the airport safety. As I understood it correctly from Mr. Nelson, that under the CUP, we have the ability to revoke it should we deem it hazardous, or under any other terms we can under the CUP, we can go down that path, I guess. is- Otherwise, I'm wondering if we shouldn't have a number 8.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Bertolio, so I'm going to ask Jason to chime in if I misspeak, but I think that as part of our adoption of these emergency rules, making the findings of these no hazard was part of that process, and so I believe that it is implicit, and I don't recall if that's been specifically stated in the proposed findings of fact by the planning department. But I do believe we have that authority, and if Jason believes that we need to add some additional language to make that very clear, I think that would be an acceptable amendment.
There you go.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Bertolio, here is our staff proposed finding of fact on effect to the public health, safety, and welfare, and nullify the intent of the development plan or the zoning resolution. The applicant has provided a drainage, erosion, dust control, grading, vegetation, environmental analysis, solar glare hazard analysis.
Well, I understand that they've provided, but I think there's still some question out there whether or not that's adequate.
Okay.
And that mitigates any potential consequences of this that have not been completely analyzed, and it maybe create a hazard. So I guess that's what my...
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Bertolli, so I would agree. I think if it's in pleasure of the commission to amend the proposed order to include some language that would require, I'm trying to think how to say this, require the installation to remain not a hazard, basically, under the FAA, and to not negatively affect county FAA grant assurances. I mean, we can work on the language, but something to that effect as a condition.
I understand studies and everything else, and they're wonderful until reality comes into play. And I'm not an expert, and yeah, there's lots of examples of them being in places. All we'd be asking for in the event that this does create a hazard or something similar to that verbiage, we could review it through the CUP and make changes or whatever, but it's something that allows that would allow us at a later date, should something really come to light that, I'm not suggesting it will. I think the analysis and the data that's been presented actually covers that, but in the event that there is an unforeseen thing, and with the, first off, potential health issues, endangerment, safety to the pilots, anyone in the planes, I would like to have at least some verbiage in there that would allow us at a later date to look at or within the CUP, that would give us some avenue to sit down with the applicant again and make appropriate changes.
So Mr. Chairman, Mr. Masterson, we just looked at the resolution, and so there is some broad language about the health, safety, and welfare of the community, and so I would concur. I think that the way the regulations are written, we would have the ability, should there be a hazard, to reopen it, but at the same time, I think if the commission is more comfortable with adding some specific language with regard to the FAA and the airport, I don't think that substantively would change the burden that we'd have, but it would certainly clearly spell it out in the CUP.
Well, I guess and I guess the more detailed you make it, the more avenues there are to argue it. I'd rather personally have it rather broad, so that you could go in and actually make any substantive changes that may be necessary. But I'm afraid if we go, and it causes too much glare, okay, well, maybe it's not, glare's not the issue. So, and like I say, I don't foresee this. I think it's just kind of an insurance that we could sit down with the applicant at a later date, should something unforeseen happen.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
if I can comment, Mr. Nelson summarized our quick little talk, of course, accurately, but the thing that concerns us is that if there's language in the permit that can be interpreted or read to allow the county to pull it for some reason that is less than certain, there needs to be some certainty so that we can get the project financed. So I understand where you're coming from, and we want to try to cooperate and get it done and get it accomplished, but it needs to be very carefully constructed, because if we go to finance and it looks like it's ambiguous, then the cost of this goes up, it's not economical, and we all lose. So I would ask Christine, she can comment on the financing aspect of it. I do think that as a base level proposition, perfectly understandable and enforceable in any court, if this project or another project suddenly evolved to the situation where it was creating a public health hazard, whether it's glare or releasing radioactive gases or whatever it is, it becomes a nuisance. It becomes a threat to public health and safety, and we've got a lot of public health officers who are really good right now at enforcing public health rules. But there are mechanisms by which the county can take action to shut this down if it does in fact create a problem. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying no, there's no way we're going to accept that. I just want to emphasize it could get real dicey if we're not very, very careful in how we would do something.
And Mr. Chairman, that's my concern also. If there is something in there that says within it's within every CUP that this becomes a hazard or whatever, if that's a standard language in a CUP, then it's unnecessary.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just, you brought it up that within a CUP, we have the ability to revoke it.
Right.
But there has to be very serious grounds, and it should be applicable to every CUP we do. And if that's already in our ordinances or our rules, then what I'm suggesting or discussing is unnecessary.
And Mr. Chairman, I think that this body has that authority, whether it is explicitly in the permit or not. I do believe that you have that authority under a number of different means for this project and any other industrial project that comes along.
Okay.
But I'm just another attorney's opinion.
We'll get another one.
Yeah, that's right. So we'll just
Mr. Nelson.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, so I don't disagree with Mr. Masterson. I do think, in looking at this and talking then with Jason, I think that our standard language does cover that in the resolution. And I would agree with your concern. I think if we get too specific and we start trying to nitpick on things, then that becomes onerous. I don't think there's any intention that if this is approved, that it would be anything but a clear approval subject to those conditions. So, in light of those concerns, I guess I would say that I feel comfortable having reviewed that with the language that we would have the ability to take appropriate action if this became an issue from health, safety, or welfare.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Mule.
Eric, this is probably a little out of your wheelhouse, but I'm going to put you on the spot anyways.
He's got a big wheelhouse, yeah.
So, everybody's talking about mitigation, removal, this, that, or whatever, if there's a hazard. But potentially, wouldn't there be, and maybe Glenn, you can address this as well, I don't know, or somebody else, wouldn't there potentially be alternate mitigations, administrative mitigations that we could do. If there's a glare at point X, have a restricted airspace corridor in that specific spot. I mean, there's other things. I don't know how fast the FAA would move on something like that, but there should be other tools in the box that we can use as well.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Millen, so I think that when we're talking about the ability to dive into the CUP, I think that would be kind of a last resort. I mean, I would imagine that if there was reports of some issues, that we would sit down with the applicant and try to mediate it either informally or through some dispute resolution mechanism in consultation with the FAA, the airport, et cetera. So I think there's lots of different permit, depending on what the issue is. It could be an easy fix. It could be that things just need to be repositioned. So it's hard to say that there's a one-size-fits-all solution. And so really what, we're getting to that if push came to shove, if there's clearly a threat to the health, safety, and welfare, and we couldn't, in good faith, work something out, then, our recourse would exist under our county regulations. But to your point, I agree. I mean, there's lots of potential steps short of that kind of final step that could resolve it, so.
If I may, to address your question, I got off the phone with the tower at Casper. Casper has a runway 26, so it's sunset. You can imagine what that looks like. You're looking right in the runway 26 is when you're taking off to the west or landing to the west. At certain times of the year, you're looking directly into the sun, and it's something we do all the time. What they do at the tower is they just switch the runways. So if they want to do that. So sometimes they do that, sometimes they don't. So that's how they mitigate the threat of the sun, which is way worse than these solar panels. I would also state that Atlanta Airport has the same as, they have runway 26, runway 27, runway 28. Atlanta Airport was the busiest airport in the country past couple years. They're not right now. But when you take off that runway, they don't have a north-south runway. That's it. So you're looking right at the sun. Landing in the sun is something I've done many, many times. It's not pleasant. You can do it. I've taken off and landed. These panels are, I've never seen glare off these panels. So you're worried about mitigation, but pilots can mitigate the risk of glare. And I would just go back to the glare survey, and it's not complicated. It's trigonometry. It's barroom pool. They really can't screw it up. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that, if you have any questions for me.
Okay. Commissioner Chadwick.
I'd like to add a number 8 to my motion of the Planning and Zoning Commission recommendation, and that would be, and I'm not quite sure about the wording on this, we need to have Eric kick in on this, and I'm not sure that it would even be enforceable, and that is that non-residential access be the first option. That simple. Is that the way we want to put it? I don't believe it's even enforceable, but.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Chadwick, so there's 3 options, I think, for access that are currently out there that are viable. The west winds one, which would include two different directions on west winds, a Melody Lane, Andy Lane option, and then a Foreman BP down there at the bottom. So I guess if you wanted to say the middle option was the least desirable, the Melody Andy option?
No, what I'm saying is the most desirable is a non-residential access.
So either the west winds AB, or the Foreman
That's right.
access.
But I don't want to box them into that either. If they find something else that doesn't go through a residential area, with 24 trucks a day and lots of kids playing. My daughter lives out there. She lives one street away from Zuni. And every time I go out there, I mean, that street is full of kids. I just don't think that's a good mix.
So, Mr. Chairman, and so what I was mulling over, I think, Jason, what we require is proof that there's legal access to the project. And so I think there's been a couple of options that would satisfy that requirement to legal access, but one of them could be through the residential area. So I guess I'm kicking around in my mind how enforceable it is. I mean, I think that we could certainly strongly urge that that be the avenue of last resort. I suppose, I mean, if you have enough concerns, and that could be a reason to deny the application, but trying to kind of thread the needle on some middle ground where we're kind of ranking them in order, I just kind of think that's administratively tricky, so.
Is a question, well, I guess before we get into that, there's a question. We need to approve the access that they desire. And it sounds like we're going to be pretty tough on approving it through a residential area. I mean, that's just a statement, but.
Mr. Chairman, we hear that. And the people that you're going to be dealing with are the people who, you know, are on this phone and are here in front of you, and I think we're sensitive to that. And one thing I think we need to remember is that the last thing these people want is a problem being in a residential area with a lot of trucks. And the last thing that these people want is a glare problem at an airport that puts people at risk. You know, so there is a shared incentive to try to avoid some of these things, all of these things, to try to make it as easy as possible. So we hear you.
Did that answer that?
Might not be much comfort, but.
Well, my question would be then, do we need to have it in there or not? Number 8.
Mr. Chairman, so I suppose, I mean, as I understand it, there's 2 potential access points that are currently legally obtained. I mean, we talk about west winds, but there's not easements, or is that, I want to make sure I understand it.
They do have easements for one of the west winds approaches. Part of it, they have easements. The foreman, when they are finishing negotiations or working on negotiations with BP.
So if we do that, right now they have no idea.
I don't know, they may be looking for money now.
But we're not taking the money either.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think.
But they don't have.
Yeah, Commissioner Chadwick, I think if you wanted to add number 8 and list a preference from the county, I mean, I think that's acceptable. But I mean, acknowledging that if they're unable to secure 2 of the 3, then they would still be legally able to use that third access, which would be through the residential point. I guess we could condition the issuance of the approval on securing access through a non-residential, access point. But as we're here today, I don't believe they've quite got that hashed out. So I think it adds a.
And I'm not sure that we want to place that restriction on them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not convinced we need to do that. I just want it to be the first option,
Sure.
the priority.
Mr. Chairman, I know that this doesn't solve it, but I believe that Commissioner Chadwick's concern has been heard. I think it's, we don't, as a business that wants to be a good neighbor, who wants to construct this project, we don't want to expose ourselves to liability, anybody else to trouble. So I think that the people you will be dealing with will try to accommodate and be as reasonable as they can and accomplish what you are trying to accomplish. And so I would urge you to leave this in the good hands of your staff and the people who are here, and I think that it could be accommodated. I think that they will do everything that they can.
Well, and that's why I left it open.
Yes, sir.
That's why I didn't close it.
Yes, sir, and I appreciate that. Yeah.
Other comments? Okay, you okay with that?
Yep.
You know, I would just have a comment, and I didn't want to do this beforehand, but I know one of the presenters talked about due diligence, and I did just that. I've been a pilot since 1978, fixed wing and helicopter. And so I went down to the solar farm at Rock Springs in Green River. And I flew around there, and I flew at traffic pattern altitude, and then I went up to 2,000 foot. I took pictures as I got a hard time over that, flying and taking pictures at the same time from one of my commissioners. But I flew around till I found the glare, and I could look directly at it. I could see my shadow going across that solar farm, and the glare, you could see a little bit of a glare, but I could look directly at it, and it was not looking like looking into the sun. Or I also took a picture of Goldeneye out here the other day when I was coming into town one morning, and that was a lot brighter coming off that water than the glare off the solar array down there. So that's why I went down there to look, because I heard about all the glare, and I wanted to see for myself, and I'll tell you, I don't think it's a problem. And it's not gonna be a problem out there that far away from the airport. The pilots are not looking down, they're looking at the airport. And then I think the way this is situated, where it's visible by the airport, it's east and west, and the sun, I don't think the sun is ever gonna really hit that tower. It just isn't. They have more problem right now looking east, let alone the panels. Just looking east from the tower in the morning is tough enough. So, and I learned how to fly at that airport that we're talking about. So, anyway, I have no problem with it. The other thing that I would say is another reason that I'm for this is they're talking about closing Dave Johnson Power Plant. Someday we might be damn fortunate to have that kind of power generated right at our doorstep for Casper. We might like that power and appreciate that, having that close to Casper. So, anyway, that's my only comment. Any other comments?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Mill?
I also got to agree with you as far as with respect to your experience. I really do. And again, thank you for serving. Also a fixed wing pilot, flown in and out of Anchorage off that runway, and it's right on the water. And if you can deal with that, the snow up here, pilots deal with glare, and that's just how it is. And so I think this is a good project, and I'm fully supportive of it.
Okay, other comments?
Yeah, just quickly, I've appreciated the professionalism of this process, so thank you to the applicant and the people who even are opposed to it. It's been a fair process, and I really appreciate when people get involved in government and weigh in and give us your opinions and your thoughts. It means a lot to us, so I acknowledge that you take the time. I know we ran really late tonight, but I'm really glad that you're here. So I appreciate that. I hold a soft spot for the airport. I think we all should. As Glenn says so well, we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in that facility. We are the only international airport in the entire state of Wyoming. It is critical that we maintain the degree of confidence that we have as people fly in and out of that. That said, I'm in tourism and for my day job, and I understand the impact economically of this project. I am supportive of it, but I do want to walk mindfully as that we mitigate any impact there would be, because we have assets that we need to protect and locals we need to protect. So thank you just so much for your time tonight and for being here. It means a lot.
Okay,
Mario. Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Bertolio.
From the first time I met Ms. Michael, I told her my view of renewables, so I don't hold that same love. I find renewables to be probably one of the worst things that our society has accepted, to replace coal-fired, uranium, nuclear plants, because guess what? They don't require the sun to shine or the wind to blow. And while it's great to have 230 megawatts, it doesn't do us much good on a cold winter night. So, but as I told her then, that is my personal view, and it should not influence how I view their project. They have met everything we've asked. I understand there's a question about location. This is private property. Private property gets to do what they want to do, provided it meets our growth boundaries, our growth plans, and whatever else. It meets those. If we start saying you can move, we don't want you here, go find someplace else, then it's not private property anymore. It's being dictated by the public. So I always find that argument to be somewhat usable, depending on what side of the fence you're on. But the problem is it still comes back to the NIMBY idea, not in my backyard. If you don't like it, move it somewhere else. Then it gets built, and then the next person comes in and says, I want to do something else, and the people that we're getting complained about are now the ones complaining about the next person. So I don't find that argument to hold that much water, especially when you look at how much distance is between where the panels are actually going to be located to the property lines of those that have come and asked or questioned whether or not it's going to affect their property values. I don't believe it will. These are not visible, as the pictures clearly indicated. So it's just going to be 2,000 acres that is used for one sole purpose, and that purpose really is benign to the area. So I don't see where the downside is. We've covered the potential if it affects air traffic in the area, and the benefits are tremendous to Natrona County. So I will support this.
Okay. Other discussion? All those in favor of CUP 20-2 and the variance
No,
20
pass
dash?
them individually.
What's that?
We have to pass them individually. Isn't that
Yes.
correct?
That's
Yeah.
Which one first?
CUP first.
CUP.
All those in favor of CUP 20-2, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? CUP 20-2 has been approved. Now, the variance 20-1. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chair, I would move that we provide a variance with a setback of 500 feet.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. I've got some discussion. 500 feet from property line or 500 foot from residential area?
Residential area.
Okay.
To be consistent with our emergency regulations, I might suggest a residential zoning district.
Okay.
To a residential zoning
Is
district.
that all right?
Yeah.
I'll accept that.
Okay. Any discussion?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
so 500 feet is pretty much standard in the oil and gas industry. When I lived in Farmington, New Mexico, I had a gas well directly across the street from me. It was noisy, but in the entire area, that was pretty much the way it was developed, because natural gas, it's right underneath the entire city of Farmington. But in this particular case, I think it's even more, reducing this is more appropriate, as I said before, this is not a noisemaker. It is not a, anything that really somebody within 500 feet would even notice unless they were looking for it. Some of the places you're going to be below the ridge and you won't even see them. So I don't see where, in this particular case, the 500 feet would be detrimental.
Okay, any other discussion? All those in favor of the variance 20-1 with that restriction of 500 foot from the property, or from other zoning districts, residential districts? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carried. Okay. Public comments. Is there anyone out there wishing to have public comment tonight?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
not on that thing.
Okay.
Okay.
Anything?
Yeah. Sean O'Brien, 7361 Forum Road, Evansville, Wyoming, 82636. We have the, God, what's the name of that thing out there? Well, we're Park East Ranchettes. And we'd like to know, I sent him things, he sent the same thing to me that I sent to him, the attorney, and from our last talk, which has been a while ago, because I said, I'll sit back and wait, and we'll see. Where are we? We're sitting out here, we've got a group of people, we don't know where our money is. Jeff won't talk to us, Jeff Moratori. He's the treasurer, president. He's the only one left on the board. Didn't have an election. We want to get moving with our property. Or, this guy's still putting homes in and selling them. Hopefully one day he'll be gone. But in the meantime, we have some real problems out there. I mean, the last time you guys asked me, do you think it's criminal? That's not me. That's for the attorneys, the state, and the county to figure out. Because we've never seen an accounting of our money. And we really want to start moving on some things, and we can't do anything because we don't have a board. And we don't know what to do. Jeff didn't have an election. They said, we got to see what's going to happen.
Okay.
So, Mr.
Eric?
Chairman, Commissioners, Mr. O'Brien, I think the last time we looked at this was in the era I would call BC, before COVID. And,
what's that? Oh, yeah.
So I did speak with an employee that handles improvement service districts. I do recall that there was not an election held. I had contacted the state, and frankly, we've been so sidetracked since then. So no, I appreciate you coming tonight and bringing that up, because that was on our radar.
Yeah.
And so we'll definitely follow up on that and get back with you.
Okay, so first, I'm not a real political kind of guy. Thanks all you guys for being here and doing your thing, Commissioner or Chairman, however you call yourselves. That's fine. You're just elected officials that we work together. I thank you for what you do. Sitting here tonight, y'all need a pat on the back. I have a great deal of better respect, let's put it that way, after sitting here for so long. But yes, if we can, and we got the protest thing going on, the courthouse is closed tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. We're going to protect ourselves, we're going to do everything right. We're just telling you we're here, we're waiting, and we have the people. You tell us what we need to do, we'll get it done. And that way we become a useful part of the county instead of a burden. Yeah. And thanks to Road and Bridges, even though he's not here, Coal Creek is 1,000% better. So I don't know if anybody came in and told you guys that, but yes. So
We got a letter.
we appreciate that. You get some letters, you should have, so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and I'll see you after the meeting, go over some stuff at finals. Yeah, thank you, appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you for being who you are.
Anyone else wishing to speak? Commissioner comments? Commissioner Kaufman?
I don't have anything. First time ever. I have nothing.
Commissioner Chadwick?
I have nothing.
Commissioner Milne?
I'm not breaking that streak.
Commissioner Bertolio?
Nothing denied, Mr. Chair.
Everybody's talked enough. Meeting adjourned.
I was gonna say something about tomorrow, but then I thought.
Yeah,
Because.
I was thinking there was a lot of stuff, but I wasn't gonna break
But
the mold either.
I don't think anybody's gonna watch us between now and then.
Okay, now.
I've been sitting in this chair for 12 hours.
Yeah, really, that's quite a session, boys.
Even driving here and there, you can at least stop, get up, stretch around the